Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. I think my first 6 months of trucking must have aged me by about 5 years, and for the first 2, I felt like I was in pure survival mode. Everything I was taught in CDL schools seemed like it was written by someone who sat behind a desk, not a wheel. And no matter how many pamphlets you read or video seminars you watch, nothing prepares you for backing up a 53-foot trailer in a truck stop fuel island at 2 a.m. and with 4 other drivers waiting behind you. I must have burned through 100 gallons of gas just practicing backing up in empty lots, ideally at night too, when nobody could see me sweat. And although I've obviously gotten better over the years, I still get tight in the chest whenever I see a truck parking in rear on a receiver that looks a little too tight. Needless to say, the learning curve was brutal. And in my 3rd week, I forgot to crank my landing gear all the way up, which cost me a damaged trailer and an $800 deductible. And I also learned really quick that the whole 11-hour driving limit isn't a suggestion. I remember I hit 10:59 one night and I thought that I could push for another 45 minutes or so to get home. Maybe 20 minutes later, I literally started seeing the reflectors on the white line start dancing in front of me. I ended up pulling over into a Walmart parking lot where I slept like the dead for 8 hours solid. Long-haul trucking is 20% learning to drive the truck and 80% learning how to live in it. It was a real grind, and then for around 4 or 5 months in, things started to click. I got my sleep schedule down with a 5-hour split and a 6-hour bunk nap that actually worked for me. And then after a while, things like chaining up in the snow or dealing with four-wheelers who think the left lane is their own birthright started to become second nature to me. It was humbling, exhausting, but honestly kind of addicting once I realized that I was actually getting good at something that scared the hell out of you in week 1. And I remember being on one particular run and thinking to myself, yeah, this is the life for me. But it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows, and back in those early days, I made a couple of seriously grave mistakes, and one of them almost cost me my life. And so one morning I'm cruising through Oregon just after crossing the Idaho state line on the 84, and it's one of those gray Pacific Northwest days. I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's me, my radio, and a flask full of Go Juice. It's all quiet on either side of me, and then suddenly, I see a truck of some kind zooming up the highway behind me. Now, as it got closer, I realized that it was a blacked-out Chevy pickup with tinted windows and no markings, and it was flying up my driver's side so fast that I might as well have been parked. Now, I remember thinking, who the hell is this asshole? But no sooner had that question entered my head, my rear view lit up like the 4th of July. The driver of the black Chevy had placed a set of red and blue LEDs on the top of his truck, and the moment I saw them, my heart jumped straight up into my throat. Unmarked units freak me out, man, and they still do. So as those lights are strobing so hard it looks like a damn rave was popping off in my mirrors, I flicked on my 4-ways and then slowed as I tried to find a spot that isn't a 6-inch shoulder with a guardrail. After my tires hit the rumble strips, I threw on the parking brakes and then sat there with my hands at 10 and 2 like I was taught. You don't reach for crap when you're getting pulled over in a rig because cops do not like that height difference. Anyway, the truck's driver hops out and he's wearing a full tactical vest and pistol belt. He's got no state police hat, just a badge attached to the same belt as his holster, but I couldn't make out any details on it. And as he came walking up to my driver's side like he owned the highway, I was running every possible thing I could have done wrong in my head. Be it my logbook, my lights, my plates, my overweight, or my IFTA sticker. I rolled my window down slow as the guy got closer, and then stopped, and peeked around my cab for a second before he spoke like he was looking for Escobar hiding in my bunk. I wished him a good evening, even called him officer, and then when he asked for my license, registration, logbook, and medical card, I handed them over. Now, I waited a couple of seconds as he looked them over and then asked who he was with. And without even looking up at me, he just simply replied, "State." and then kept on looking over my stuff. Now, he looked for no more than maybe 10 to 20 seconds, but it felt like much longer. Now, meanwhile, I'm just sitting there with my hands at 10 and 2, hoping he's just gonna tell me that I got a faulty taillight or something and then send me on my way. But then instead, he told me to step out of the cab because he wanted to see what was inside my trailer. Now, my stomach just about dropped straight through the frame rail when he said it, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I was still so terrified of making a mistake and losing the respect of my boss and my fellow truck drivers. And after putting on my high-vis and climbing out of my cab, I walked around to the back with the guy in his black uniform, and he tells me to break the seal and open her up, both doors too, because he wants to, quote, see all the way up the nose. And all the words and terms he used, they made me think that he had a lot of experience, so even though I didn't recognize the badge on his belt and didn't have any name tags or an insignia on his shirt or vest, I just sort of went with it. I pulled my Gerber and cut through the plastic bolt seal, number 78299-1K, I still remember it, and then dropped it into my pocket like I'd been taught. I swung open the right door first and then the left, making sure to latch them both back. And the whole time the guy was watching me, arms crossed, cold as ice. I wasn't 100% sure what the load was, I just knew that it was written in as sporting goods, but that's not what a cop would have been interested in, not unless they got a tip that we were moving drugs or something. No, instead, I figured he just wanted to check my pallets, make sure that they're floor-loaded, tight, and no more than 3 tiers high, etc. Some cops get antsy about voids either, as in like small spaces between your pallets. But this guy didn't strike me as a regular traffic cop, and neither did he seem interested in the spaces between the pallets. I told him my bills were clean, that there was no hazmat inside and nothing which required temp control either. But he didn't say a single word in reply. Instead, he just kept on checking what I was carrying until he suddenly started poking his lights between pallets, kicking straps and checking for false walls. I figured it was useless to ask the guy what he was looking for, so I just sort of stood there watching him as he took one last look in the scuff. And after that, he came walking back toward me before hopping out of the truck and looking like it was something he'd done 1,000 times before. I asked the guy if I was good to close the trailer over again, but I knew that he wouldn't leave just yet because I needed the paperwork to explain why the seal was broken. But then instead of answering my question, he asked if I got the truck's keys on me. I told him no, that they were in the cab. But the guy told me to stay where I was and that I needed to hang tight for him. And it was only then that I started to get frustrated, but I didn't get mad. I just asked him what was going on. But once again, the guy ignored my question, and then he raised 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a loud, ear-piercing whistle. And this is the part where I started to get really confused, not to mention nervous too, because the second the guy whistled all loud like that, maybe 12 to 15 of his buddies appeared from the nearby tree line and then came running towards the truck. I panicked, and my first thought was to run for the cab, but as I started to back up away from him, the guy pulled the pistol from his holster and told me not to move. All I could do was freeze at the sight of the gun and raise my hands in this sort of don't shoot me kind of way. I didn't have the right certification to drive long haul with a gun, so I kind of just screwed up either way, so like I said, all I did was freeze up. And the only thing that got me moving again was when the guy told me to get on my knees. And since I really didn't like the idea of that, I told him no, while I just kept on backing up towards my door. Now I'm proud of myself for that little piece of defiance, no matter how brief it was, but it didn't last. And after the guy cocked that pistol back, had it ready to fire, and gave me the order a second time, it was like my knees involuntarily buckled underneath me. I didn't want to comply, but I also knew it was my best shot at staying alive. If I ran, I had maybe 20% chance of getting away. But lunge at the guy and try to be a hero, then I was a dead man. So I kneeled, put my hands behind my head like he asked, and then watched as he took a few careful steps towards me and put his pistol right up to my forehead. Now call me dumb all you want, I know I was, but it was only then that things really clicked for me. Not even the biggest a-holes among the state troopers or feds would be dumb enough to put a gun to a man's head, let alone an innocent trucker. Whoever these guys were, they weren't police, and I very much doubted that they worked for the government. Saying that, I couldn't rule it out entirely, not in the moment. And that's what pushed me to ask him, "Who the hell are you guys?" And as you can probably guess, he didn't answer my question. Instead, he did that same thing of asking one of his own. And with that gun pushed right up against my forehead, the guy asked if I was an American. And then when I told him yeah, he told me, not just a citizen, and then asked if I was a real American. I didn't know exactly what he meant by that, because what the hell does a real American even mean? But all the same, I told him I was born and raised in New Jersey, so yes, I was a real American. And there was a moment after that where I was kind of thinking, is this guy from immigration or something? What the hell is this? But then, just from the look on his face, I knew this was almost personal for him. He didn't look at all that satisfied with my answer. And then after asking my name, he asked me, "Are you a Jew?" Now, I'm not Jewish, and although my dad was also born and raised in New Jersey, his parents are both from Turkey and I inherited some of their darker features. And that actually wasn't the first time that I'd been asked if I was Jewish, but the first time, I just calmly explained that no, my dad was Turkish Muslim. But obviously, given the implication of the guy's question, I knew it was not a good idea to tell him that. And so instead, I thought on my feet and told him my dad was Greek. Greek Christian, too, just because I figured that that was what he wanted to hear. But again, he didn't seem entirely satisfied with that answer. Now, it looked like he was thinking for a second, and then he nodded and gave me the closest thing I got to an explanation. He said since I was a real American, I should be happy that he and his buddies were getting their hands on the contents of my truck. He told me to be a good little citizen and reported exactly what had happened so I wouldn't lose my job. But he also said that I could be happy that the goods were going to a very worthy cause, and that what might hurt me in the short term, and very superficially at that, would benefit me a whole lot in the long term. And while he's saying all of that to me, his buddies, who were also wearing all black military gear and a lot of face masks too, were busy unloading my truck. And I later found out that the sporting goods that I was trucking were more like a home defense haul, because it consisted of a lot of ammunition, a ton of MREs, and even things like bulletproof vests too. It wasn't all stuff like that. There were a lot of blaze orange hunting clothing in there too, but those boys in black seemed to know exactly which pallets they were supposed to be looking for, and once they had as much as they could carry, they hauled ass back in the direction of the tree line carrying 2 or 3 boxes apiece. The guy in front of me, who was just wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, kept that gun on me until all of his buddies were out of sight. And then he asked me something which had my heart pounding in my chest. He asked me if he needed to shoot me, because if I was going to go rushing back to my cab once he turned his back to grab a gun and try to be a hero, then he'd just blow me away right there and then and save us both the blood and ammo. I told him I didn't have one, which, like I already said, was the God's honest truth. And he just laughed as he put his own gun away and told me that I should really see about getting something to protect myself with. Then after telling me to stay on my knees till he'd driven off, the guy walked back to his truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and took off down the highway in that blacked-out Chevy of his. Procedure stated that I was to inform the cops of any kind of robbery as soon as I was physically able to. And so, that's the first thing I did. I then called my route manager from the same payphone to let him know that I'd be delivering late and light. And he actually laughed as he told me that I was the first truck to be robbed in just over 20 years. The only one driving for our company, at least. I know he was only laughing because I was okay and that only the trailer had been stolen, not the semi itself. Now, I'd be lying if I didn't feel a sort of rush from it too, having gone from thinking that I was going to die to smoking a cigarette at the side of the highway and making jokes with the cops photographing the open doors of my trailer. I was later told that the people who robbed me were most likely members of what the cops called the Silent Brotherhood, some militia-type group who were based in the Pacific Northwest. They went on to do a bunch of other stuff like that, robbing and killing, and I always felt very lucky that I got to walk away, and I didn't end up like that radio DJ guy that they ended up murdering just a couple of years later. I heard the FBI ended up bringing the Silent Brotherhood down, but I also know that there were many more militias out there. Maybe not all of them are the DJ murdering, trailer robbing kind, but just them existing is enough to give me the willies. A few years ago, after I'd left college and wasn't really ready to become a career adult yet, I took a job working as a fry cook at a local fast food restaurant. It wasn't a chain restaurant, it was one of those where the signage and font try and make it look like it's KFC or something, but it obviously isn't. And everything from the hygiene to the menu to the prices make it clear that it's knockoff, and people freaking love these places. Fried chicken and fries for $1 cheaper than KFC? Hell yeah, sign me up. And so it was actually rewarding work. I didn't get paid much, but I was pushing my body to the limit while at the same time I was doing a long-term master's degree, so it felt like a really productive member of society, you know? And I don't know why I'm justifying all of this to you. And if you want to spend your entire damn life working fast food, more power to you. The world would be an inferior place if we couldn't just go to our local McDaniel's or Arkansas Fried Chicken or Out and About Burger or, you know, the official ones. Now anyways, the point is, I'm not really sure how the hygiene and waste disposal and official things work in the big brand franchise restaurants. What I do know is that at the little local owned store that I worked at, which I'm just going to call Bugger Kong, things worked in a very certain way. And one of those ways was we had a big metal oil drum out back where we'd dump the used oil from the fryer when it was time to change it. And then we just kind of left the barrel alone until it got full enough to get one of the guys to haul it to God knows wherever it was that they disposed of a big old barrel of vegetable oil. I should also mention that while the barrel had a lid, it was kind of just placed on there, just enough so it didn't fill the barrel with rain and cause us to have to take disposal trips early. But if someone had wanted to go into the barrel, then they could pretty easily. But why the heck would anyone want to go into a barrel of used dirty cooking oil? It's not like there was any good reason to keep it under lock and key, right? It was out back in the chain fenced off area with the dumpsters and all other types of gross crap. So I was General Chick who does whatever needs doing as my official title. Go-to Georgie they called me because, well, my name's Georgia and people would come to me whenever some crap needed doing. Short of staff on the front counter, ask Georgie. Need puke mopped up from the floor in the tiny seating area? Yep, me. But my main job there, which I was damn good at for what the job entailed, was fry cook. I flipped a burger meaner than a dad with a midlife crisis and a kiss the cook apron on. And I had more than one customer, always middle-aged men who liked the cut of my uniform, jib, tell me that they liked coming in best when I was on the grill. And yeah, look, I was a sassy, fairly hot post-grad working in a grungy fast food restaurant. I've seen Kevin Smith movies, and I know it makes me look cool to play up to this. Sue me. And if you want to picture me, at least back then, I looked a bit like that chick who's the singer of Linkin Park now, but in my early 20s, with more piercings and a singing voice that'd make your ears bleed. And I know none of this is massively relevant, but I want you to have the perfect picture of the scene just so it makes sense when I perfectly, in minute and explicit detail, describe the visuals of what happened that day. You'll thank me, trust me. So one day, I've been working the griddle all day and I was just about DWTS, done with this crap, but I used to say it like that to A, make me sound cool, and B, avoid getting scolded by my very sweet Christian mother. And so of course, right at the end of my shift, just as the sun was about to set, my manager Karen, yes, their actual name, who never liked me, told me that I had to haul my butt out into the back lot, lugging that oil with me and dump it in the barrel. Oh, and that should be the last of it, so I had to call on the boys to come collect it in the morning. And sure, they're gonna love that. And there's a way that you drain the oil of our fryers that lets you drain the oil into 5-gallon buckets. Thankfully, it was all cooled by now because the fryer hadn't been used for a while, so it was safe to drain the first 5-gallon bucket and strain my whole entire butt, dragging it out the back door backwards. And as soon as I got outside into the little chained-off backyard that served as our exterior area, I knew something was wrong. I'd spent plenty of time out here on my cigarette breaks and it always stank, but this time it stank to high heaven. So I placed the oil bucket down in front of the back door to stop it slamming shut, and I turned around to see exactly what had caused our garbage area to stink worse than Satan's taint. First thing I saw was rotten food just sort of strewn all over the ground. The wild thing here is our dumpster had been emptied that morning, so there was no way that the rotten food had come from our restaurant. Someone had brought it here, and that someone, well, it was pretty clear who she was. And the first thing I noted was a shopping cart, adorned with all types of trinkets and decorations like you often see homeless folks pushing around. And then I saw the presumably homeless lady herself, and she was, I kid you not, in the oil barrel. She was absolutely covered in weeks of old, filthy cooking oil. She hadn't seen me looking, and as I watched, she ducked into the barrel and submerged herself in the liquid. I actually counted. She was down in that oil for 45 seconds, and then she burst out, letting out a gasp of what I can only describe as ecstasy. Her mouth was thrown wide open, cooking oil pouring from her mouth, and then she saw me. She spat a wad of cooking oil straight at me, thankfully nowhere near close enough to hit me, but still I backed away. And did I mention that this woman was extremely, depressingly old and also extremely naked? I could only see her bare, saggy chest at this point, but I later saw the full glory of her nudity, so I can say with confidence that she was naked, diving in our oil barrel. Despite what I said, I'm not going to go into detail describing an emaciated, sore-ridden octogenarian covered in cooking oil coming bursting out of the barrel. You can probably imagine what that looks like. But when she saw me and spat the oil at me, it was like a switch flipped in her brain. Maybe it was the shame of getting caught taking an oil bath surrounded by rotten food, but I doubt it. She did, however, start absolutely shrieking at me and pointing a very gnarled accusatory finger. If it had been the 1690s, then I would have been straight up on WhatsApp to the latest witch finder, telling them that we had some witch burning to do. But alas, this was 2023 at the time, so all I was able to do was kind of back away and say, "Hey lady, chill out. You just can't stay in our barrel of oil." And the oil lady started thrashing, shrieking about this, and I could tell what was going to happen. She was angrily reaching out towards me, flailing with rage and fury, so of course, yes, the entire barrel of oil tumbled forward, sending foul-smelling vegetable oil flooding across the lot. I tried to jump back further but hit the wall. In my infinite wisdom, I decided to kick the bucket. Not in that way, but I mean the bucket that was propping the door open. I didn't want any of this crap getting into the kitchen and giving Karen an excuse to Karen at me. And the barrel of oil managed to topple forward towards this woman, and the back door of the restaurant slammed shut, i.e. locked. And this meant that I was trapped with this oil woman in a small fenced-in area. Another thing I noticed was that the oil barrel appeared to be filled with more rotting food, and we certainly hadn't been putting it in there, and I had this horrible feeling from the state of it that the old woman had taken the food into the barrel with her and had been eating it underwater. Well, under oil, I guess. The ancient oil-covered naked woman was crawling across the asphalt toward me, occasionally trying to get her feet and then slipping each time. Now I was torn. What the hell did I do? I felt bad for this clearly mentally ill old lady homeless person covered in cooking oil and chowing down on rotten garbage, but she was also crawling towards me like some kind of disgusting fetish weirdo from the garage, and from the look on her face, she had slippery murder in mind. The fact that she was screaming at me, calling me a witch and saying that she was going to tear my insides out and fill my hoo-ha with oil wasn't exactly filling me with charity towards helping this lunatic either. And so I did maybe the most epic move of my life. I ran around the oil spill, aiming for the dumpster. I was going to climb on the top, but then leap over the 8-foot chain fence, leaving this woman trapped inside the lot, and then I'd go around the front of the restaurant and call the cops. This was mostly a good idea, except I misjudged how fast the oil woman could slide across the ground in her oily nakedness, and I was almost at the dumpster when she grabbed my ankle, her slippery hands trying to drag me into the slimy puddle that she was rolling in. Hell no, I was having none of this. And so I did probably the worst thing that I'd ever have to do in my life. I stamped on an 80-plus-year-old woman's wrist. I wasn't proud of it, but it worked, and she howled and let go. Now listen, if you saw her, if you saw how clearly strong and weird this woman was despite her age, then you wouldn't judge me. Hell, for all I know, she was in her 40s and just aged really badly from meth or some other drugs. So, as she rolled around in pain, I knocked her stupid, dumb shopping cart out of the way and threw myself on top of the dumpster and took the leap of my life to expertly vault over the chain link fence. The oil coating my sneakers and hands didn't quite allow this plan to come to pass, and I almost managed it. Instead, my pants caught on the chain link fence and I was left hanging upside down, blissfully on the outside of the yard, but somehow caught by the tear in my knee of my jeans, so I was just sort of hanging there, upside down. And there was a moment where I was considering that I could undo my belt and slip out of my pants and fall to the ground in my underwear, but there was already a naked elderly lady and gallons of oil. There was no way that I was turning this into more of an effed up, weird concept than it already was. And instead, I shamelessly and tearfully started screaming for help. Thankfully, a passerby saw me and helped me down, and then recoiled in absolute horror when they saw the scene that I just escaped from. Now, short ending to a long story, I limped my way back to the restaurant while this passerby very kindly kept an eye out on the old woman just in case she found some way to try and escape. And how she'd gotten in, shopping cart included, was absolutely beyond me. And the best I could think is that she'd picked the padlock to the yard and then for some reason locked it behind her again. It didn't feel like this was the first time that she'd taken a bath in our oil. It felt almost too planned. Now, Karen handled it, called the cops, and I gave a statement, and then got sent home for the day. I never really found out much about that old lady. All I knew was that she definitely wasn't pressing charges, and she was getting the help that she needed, so I guess that was nice. Now listen, I tried to make this sound as funny as possible, but the whole thing was absolutely freaking terrifying, and the only way that I can handle the story is really by joking about it. I still have genuine nightmares about her bursting out of that barrel, oil pouring from mouth and screaming just gibberish at me. I still get sick if I smell anything rotting, and I absolutely do not work in fast food anymore. I just can't. And I know the event could have happened anywhere with a drum of oil, I guess, but I can't handle the idea of ever encountering anything like that again. I mean, could you? No matter how I try and turn this into comedy, it's the most horrifying thing I've ever dealt with, and I hope to all that is holy that I never, ever have a reason to share a story like this ever again. But you know, if you want to use a terrifying woman bursting out of an oil drum as the video thumbnail, I think that I'd probably be okay with that. Maybe. At least something positive could come from this absolute crap show. In my 25 years as a long-haul trucker, I've been to some incredible places, and I've met some incredible people too. It never ceases to amaze me how kind, compassionate, and downright wholesome folks can be to one another and to me. But it also never ceases to amaze me just how damned creepy some folks can be too, and it stands to reason that it's always the ones you least expect. Many years ago, I was driving a big rig through Colorado snowdrifts, and on this leg of the journey, I was somewhere between Denver and Aspen, and it must have been close to 1 o'clock in the morning. Driving an 18-wheeler at night is one thing, but driving through snowy mountains at night is another thing entirely. Accounting for wind chill, outside temperatures reaching -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and then while it's snowing, all your high beams do is create a wall of bouncing light that can cause some really nasty headaches. And all your road markings, reflectors, and shoulders just vanish under the drifting snow, and then there are patches of black ice that you don't know are even there till it's way too late to do anything about it. Mirrors turn to useless bricks of snow. Gas gelling can cause a whole bunch of engine problems, then hit the brakes in the wrong way, and you can jackknife an 80,000-pound piece of hardware. Needless to say, it can be really tough on a man's nerves, especially if he doesn't have much experience out there on the road. And that's exactly what kind of situation I was in, when something just about scared me half to death. So, I was rolling down I-70 and I'd just passed Wheeler Junction headed westbound when out of nowhere, this little pink blur stepped out in front of me from the snowbank on my right. It was like time slowed down for a second. I knew it was a little girl, and I knew the only thing that I could do to save her life was slam on my brakes, and that's what I did. The Jake brake screamed, and the trailer groaned as my ABS, the anti-lock braking system, hammered like a machine gun. I yanked the wheel to the left, trying to put the whole damned rig into the oncoming lane because the right side was nothing but guardrail and what looked like a 500-foot drop on the other side. Snow was flying up the tires, chains were rattling like they were fixing to shatter, and there I am, praying harder than I ever did in church that this trailer doesn't jack and take that little girl with it. She looks up at me with these big eyes, frozen like a deer while it still feels like time is dragging, and I remember the split second where I thought, oh God, this is it. I'm gonna be the guy on the news who flattened a kid on a mountain highway and die myself. And the rig slowed, and somehow the good Lord gave me just enough room because I ended up missing the girl by no more than the width of a Bible, I'd say. I slid past, doing maybe 15 with a trailer fishtailing, and while I'm sliding, I catch a glimpse of the girl in the mirror. She just stood there, having not moved a muscle while the snow swirlies danced around her. I got my rig stopped maybe 100 yards down when it finally came to a halt. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. I looked out into my side mirror, which I could now see out of thanks to all the snow having been shaken from it. And there she was, still standing there, looking like she was half frozen already. I set the brakes and turned on my four ways so that people could see my lights before they saw my truck, then hopped out into the powdered snow piled up on the shoulder. The wind was cutting through my jacket as I sort of went back up the hill, back when the little girl came into view again, and I called out to ask if she was okay and where her mama was. But all she did was look at me with those big eyes, all quiet, and then when I saw how blue her lips were, I walked over and scooped her up. She was as light as a sack feather and she didn't even fight. She just buried her face in my jacket as I hustled her back to my truck. I climbed in, pulled the door shut, and then after sitting her on the passenger seat, I cranked the heat to a Mexican wedding, as they say, and then grabbed my old Carhartt coat and wrapped her up like a burrito. She didn't talk for maybe a good 10 minutes. She just sat there, all bundled up with her teeth chattering so hard that I thought that she might hurt herself. I poured a little bit of coffee from my flask into a cup, and she managed a few sips and then just curled up and stared at my dash lights like they were hypnotizing her. I eased us back on the road, very gentle-like and keeping it under 30, and then as the heaters were roaring, the colors started creeping back into her cheeks, but she still didn't talk until we were maybe 10 miles down the hill, and when she did, it was like crawlers creeping over my skin. Because all she said was, "He's gonna get me." I asked, "Who's gonna get you, sweetie? Who are you talking about?" But the cold must have had her head all scattered because all she said again was, "He's gonna get me. Please don't let him get me." I asked her again who was going to get her, and then after thinking for a minute, she told me she didn't know his name, just that he was going to get her. I told her she didn't have to worry, because there was no way anyone was going to get her out of my damn truck, but not without a damn good fight anyway. And that seemed to calm her down a little. And then when I told her I was going to get her back to her mommy, I saw her smile for the first time. And then maybe a minute later she said, "You better go quick. The man who's going to get me can run really fast." I told her not as fast as my truck, thinking it would reassure her, but she responded right away with, "Nuh-uh. He can run even faster than a truck." I told her I doubted that very much and that she didn't need to worry. That didn't seem to satisfy her, but she stayed quiet as she screwed up her face like she was thinking something that she didn't know how to put into words. And a few minutes later, after realizing that I hadn't asked her yet, I asked the girl if she knew where she lived. She said she was from some place near Denver, some kind of suburb, but I can't remember the name. And then when I asked how she ended up in the snow, she explained that she escaped from the man who was keeping her. And it was like talking about him jogged her memory because she immediately began telling me to drive faster because if I didn't, the man who'd kept her was going to catch up to us. Now once again, I'm telling her, "That's not gonna happen, kiddo. Ain't nobody driving this thing off the road." But she shook her head and told me, "He doesn't need to drive faster. He can fly." And at first hearing her say that just kind of made me sad. Some sick monster had obviously tried to scare her into obedience by telling her all sorts of crap about him being able to run really fast or even fly. But then, as I wondered what kind of freak would do something like that, just picturing some creep running as fast as my truck or flying through the night sky before landing on my cab, it just about creeped the hell out of me. And I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me want to drive a little faster, even though I knew damn well that what she was saying was impossible. Now, it didn't help that I asked her if she would tell me anything about the man who'd taken her. And we'd already established that she'd been taken from the parking lot of a grocery store because she mentioned something about shopping with Mommy, and then the next thing that the man was holding her hand and telling her that they were going to find her mom. Obviously, that was a lie because she hadn't seen her mom since. But when I asked her for some specifics about him, what he looked like or what kind of house he lived in, all she said was that he lived out in the woods and he looked, in her words, real scary. Now, I know it might sound dumb because this was a kid saying it in some scared little girl voice, but when she said he looked real scary, it sent an actual shudder through me. I guess it tapped into my own long-lost sense of childlike imagination, and I guess it figured that some freak who'd abduct a kid would be real scary looking, but just the thought alone scared me. I then asked the girl if she could tell me anything about where she was kept, and when she said no, that it was always dark and she could never see anything, I just figured I better stop asking. I was taking her to the cops, who'd no doubt ask her a ton of their own questions, and I doubted I was helping any by making her talk about it. But I also had this terrible fear that for some reason she might not survive till we got to the cops. My sister is a nurse, and the thing she told me about kids that really stresses her out is how they hang on and hang on and hang on, then bang, they just slip away on you real fast. The girl was talking, and she looked way better than she did out on the highway, but there was a part of me that thought, what if she doesn't make it? And not just because of the hypothermia that she might have suffered, but because the person chasing her might still have caught up with us at that point. And I knew well enough no man could fly, and that no one could run as fast as a truck either, but he could most likely drive, and if he wanted to keep his ass out of prison, he'd be on the road behind us looking for that girl. And that was my thought process at the time anyways, and as you can imagine, I was creeped the hell out on top of everything the girl had said. But no one caught up with us. The girl made it to the county sheriff's office in a place called Vale, and that, boys and girls, is where we parted ways. Now, I still think about that little girl sometimes, though. She'll be a woman by now, maybe even with kids of her own, and while I have no doubt that she remembers the trucker who pulled her out of that snow and stopped her freezing to death, I hope to God that I get to meet her again one day, so I can find out why she was out there in the first place. Now, I didn't read anything in the local newspaper about it. No reporters came knocking on my door to take a statement, and no cops either, so I don't know if they ever caught that scary-looking guy. I'm just hoping that that little girl is reunited with her mama, and that she grew up to be happy, in spite of whatever she'd endured. My first job at a restaurant did not last all that long. I messed up, and I messed up big. It was a small Greek restaurant, all low-light mood lighting and authentic music. The owner, Mr. Tavaloris, was a larger-than-life character who could be the friendliest, funniest guy in the world unless he was in one of his moods, and then merely being in the restaurant felt like life or death. A couple of weeks into my work there, I was a waiter. Mr. Tavalorius came to me and told me inexplicably that I'd be in charge of front of the house. Not only that, it was going to be a quiet night, so I'd be the only waitstaff on hand, and to call his brother if things got out of hand and I needed a hand. Alternatively, if we had no diners arrive by 9 p.m., I was to shut up shop early, send the sole member of the kitchen staff home, and then hang around until my shift ended at 11, cleaning up and keeping an eye on the place. I didn't really like the sound of this, so I politely asked why I needed to stick around. Tavalorius told me that a guy might be dropping by, but don't worry, he was a professional, and I'd know what was up when I met him. Now, this was classic Mr. T. He liked to turn everything into an epic mystery saga. I'm not sure if he had a poor grasp of the English language or just liked to pretend he did. There was a rumor circulating some years later that he wasn't even Greek and had ever even been to Europe. And having worked for the man even for a couple of weeks, I honestly could believe this. 9 p.m. came and went, and we hadn't had a single customer all night. I sent the chef, an extremely young woman by the name of Maria, home early and went about doing God knows what, and I set the sign to close, did a half-assed job of cleaning up the already immaculate restaurant, and ended up playing my Game Boy Color. Now, this was back in those days. Now, near 10 p.m., there was an urgent knock at the front door. I paused whatever game I was playing and headed over to alert the potential customer that, sorry, we'd closed, and no, I didn't know why, but thems were the breaks. And then I remembered that Tavalorius had told me to expect a guy, and it was pretty clear looking through the glass door that this was the guy that I'd be expecting. It was an exterminator, all kitted out in gear, and I could see his purple van parked back over in the handicap spot, and that the guy had a hand-rolled cigarette hanging between his lips. The label on his jumpsuit read, Roach A Go-Go. It was cute, so I just let him in. He told me in a thick Serbian accent that I had been expecting him. Didn't ask, just told. And I was like, sure, buddy, you're the guy, right? And he seemed to like this, declaring that yes, he was the guy, and he had a problem to take care of for Tavaloris before things got out. The exterminator told me that he had to go work in the kitchen, and this kind of unnerved me because what the hell did we have living in our kitchen? I asked him and he said not to worry, it was preventative, that Tavaloris' bosses didn't like the idea of rats in their establishment. I didn't even know Tavaloris had a boss. I'd always assumed that he owned the restaurant, but hey, I guess this all made sense. And so the exterminator headed through, and maybe my alarm bell should have rang when all he took in with him was a huge black plastic crate that he held by a handle. But what the heck did I know about extermination and laying poison or rat traps? The guy wasn't in the kitchen too long. He quickly stepped out of the door, too quickly, I realized much later, and then clicked the latch shut. The fella told me that I should just go home and leave the kitchen overnight for the poison to settle and deter any rats. None of this seemed weird to me, and Tavaloris had basically told me the same thing, to go home early, so I ushered the Roaches A Go-Go to his van and bid him a good night and got into my own battered Buick 8, my pride and joy. Now, I'm just going to jump ahead a little here and explain something about what Tavaloris actually intended by having me stay alone at the restaurant. Now, he was expecting some very angry guys to show up and punish him for some transgression or other because, shock and horror, my dodgy Greek boss was in with the mob. Gasp. Who could have seen that coming? And so what he figured, I think, was that this mob boss's thugs would find me there alone, figured that I might be a big deal to Tavaloris, and dish out a beating that I wouldn't soon forget. At least I hope he only expected a beating. The idea that I was being cast out as a sacrificial lamb is a little too terrifying to actually consider. The thing is, these mob guys were smart, smarter than your average gangster. They didn't play things by dishing out beatings and burying Joe loose lips in concrete or whatever these guys usually did. They specialized in fear. I heard later that their enforcers were nicknamed the Ghouls, and I can understand why. Their intimidation came in the style of scaring the absolute living crap out of their target, and their target was Tavaloris, not me. Unfortunately, it was still me and the kitchen girl from the night before, Elle, who made the discovery. Tavaloris had arranged for us to open up that next morning too, maybe to test if I'd actually show up for work, get a vague scope of the situation. I did indeed show up to work, none the wiser, and explained to Elle as we entered the restaurant that the exterminator had been there the night before and laid down poison in the kitchen to deter rats. Now, Elle was young, probably too young to be running a kitchen, but she was whip smart, and immediately her face went whiter than usual as she told me, "Hey, that's not how an exterminator works. You can't just lay rat poison down in the kitchen where we prepare food." This was effed. We were probably going to have to dispose of any of the food the exterminator had access to. And thankfully that shouldn't have been very much since the pantry and the freezer were locked and Elle and another chef kept the key, but at the very least, we might have to replace some pans and some fresh veggies. That's a bummer, I thought as I opened the door. And then the next thing I'm doing is letting out the most high-pitched, girlish scream of my life. I slammed the door shut and began trembling, shaking like I was in septic shock. I could barely get my words out. I was almost sobbing, and bear in mind, I'm a grown-ass man. Elle was shaking me, asking me what the hell was wrong. Was someone dead in there? Did we have to call the cops? Now, she moved to open the kitchen door, and I just about screamed no. I think I scared her more by grabbing her than anything else, at least until she looked through the window into the kitchen. To Elle's credit, she wasn't quite as freaked out as me, but she didn't suffer from crippling arachnophobia. You see, the thing is, the kitchen was absolutely filled with bugs. These were the same type of bugs, mostly around the same size, about 4 inches long maybe, and at first I thought they were spiders. But Elle, who was able to study them a bit more, pointed out that they had 10 legs and not 8. There were hundreds of them. They were just sort of milling around the kitchen, kind of just hanging out. And at first I couldn't believe that they were real. They looked like spiders by way of some messed up horror writer and then some, and this was freaking New Jersey, not the Australian outback or the Middle East. Things like this just didn't live here. House centipedes were bad enough, but seeing the kitchen of our restaurant filled with these monsters was enough to absolutely break me. I begged, pleaded with Elle to latch the door back up, and broke into a sobbing pile on the floor as she called Tavaloris. And the man himself showed up 10 minutes later, furious that we interrupted him. Of course, there weren't monster spiders in the kitchen. Maybe a handful had gotten in, sure, but we must have both lost it. I didn't even have time to tell him about the exterminator or yell for him not to enter the kitchen before he unlatched the door and stormed straight in. Now, I've never seen a fat, unfit man run quite so fast as I did then. Tavaloris came crashing out of the kitchen, hollering and howling, yelling at us for not telling him what to expect and cursing the redacted family who I don't want to draw the ire of even to today. Elle thankfully had the foresight to rush over and pull the door shut, locking it again. But not before a couple of these beasts had come ambling out into the restaurant. Elle somehow managed to trap one of them under a glass, and the others started coming towards me. It looked at me, and I looked at it. Its face looked like, well, let's just say it looked like lady parts. Somehow this made this hideous spider being a little less terrifying to me, and I couldn't really bring myself to kill it. And instead, I slowly backed away and let Elle capture that one too. But there was still the problem of the absolute hundreds of these horrible bugs in the kitchen. Tavaloris was just screaming, "No cops, no cops," and eventually calmed down enough to call an actual exterminator pal of his. Elle and I were sent home for the day, and the restaurant was closed for the next 3. Needless to say, I didn't return to work when my unpaid, I may add, vacation was over. I was done with that job. If Tavaloris had pissed off the redacted family, then I did not want to go between him and the ghouls. Now, this was their harmless warning, their opening gambit, so to speak. Things would escalate from here, and I wanted no part of that. Now, I later found out from Elle that the creatures were camel spiders. Not spiders at all, or were they scorpions, despite their other name of wind scorpion. They're wholly their own thing. Not really dangerous at all, but they do have a painful bite. But what creeped me out the most was that the ghouls had collected enough of these to release around 100 into our kitchen, and you could bet money that this wasn't the only stock of horrific creatures and creepy crawlies that they actually had. It made me sure of one thing. I didn't want to work in the service industry. I didn't want to work with anyone who messed with that redacted family or became the target of the ghouls. And I certainly didn't want to find out the kind of thing that they do to escalate if releasing 100 camel spiders into a restaurant was their initial warning. A few years later, long after I had moved out of New Jersey, I heard that Tavaloris restaurant had closed down, some kind of health inspection issue. Apparently it was really bad. A guest had found a baby bird fetus in their falafel or something. Whether this was another threat from the ghouls or just Tavaloris being a really terrible restaurant owner, I'll never know. And really, I never want to know. So back in 1988, when I was just 18, I was slinging boxes at a warehouse for minimum wage. I had no plans for college, no plans to do just about anything, really. Until one day, this good old boy rolls up in this shiny red Kenworth. And he seemed like a character, so we got to talking, and that's how I found out that he made 4 times what I did just for driving a big rig across the country. And I remember looking at my busted up sneakers and thinking, hell, I could do that. So I took all the money I'd saved up to buy a car and I used it to get my CDL instead. Which, for those of you who don't know, is a commercial driver's license which you need to operate trucks, buses, or anything that transports hazardous materials. And about a month later, I was driving over to my first job interview, and I've been trucking ever since, coming up on damn near 40 years now. And like any job, trucking's got its ups and downs. When the freight's rolling, the money's great, and if you run hard and stay mostly legal, you can clear 6 figures a year no problem at all. Dispatch might decide the destination, but once the key's in the ignition, it's just you, the CB, and 36 tons of steel and rubber. I've seen the whole country on somebody else's dime, and as long as the load's on time and you ain't tearing up equipment, there ain't nobody breathing down your neck. Only trouble is, those damned air ride seats still feel like concrete when you're sitting on them for 10 to 12 hours a day. And then forget about things like Thanksgiving because you're eating your turkey and yams out of a Tupperware container on the side of the I-80. But if you ask me, the worst part of the job isn't the fuel prices, the insurance, or the shippers and receivers that treat you like something stuck to the bottom of the shoe. It's not even the lumpy bunks, the truck stop slop, or the showers that look like a damn crime scene. Those you can get used to. The worst thing about the job is ironically the very same thing that sometimes is the best thing about the job. And that's the people you meet while out on the road. 6 years into my career, I was hammered down and eastbound on the I-80 somewhere just west of Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, it was around 2 in the morning and it was just me and my engine doing about 68 while she sang that old Detroit song of hers. My CB was quieter than a church mouse, and the only thing breaking the silence was the wind whistling over my cab. And then suddenly, out of the dark, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving on the shoulder. I slowed the rig a little and flipped my high beam down, and then there she was. A girl of no more than about 19 or 20 years old wearing a thin white sundress. Her hair's all wild and she ain't got nothing but sandals on by the looks of things, and she's sticking her thumb out, trying her damnedest to get me to notice her. Now, I've heard every scary story from here to Reno about picking up hitchhikers. The ones about scamming lot lizards, the ones about nutcases or robbers, even the old vanishing girl spooky story that every trucker must have heard 100 times by now. Usually I'd have just kept on driving. Ain't my circus, ain't my monkey, as they say. But like I said, something about the way she looked had me easing that 389 Peterbilt over onto the shoulder. And I set the parking brakes, hopped out of my cab, and then started walking back slow so I didn't spook her. And when I was close enough, I called out to her, asking if she wanted to ride. And she just nodded, and then came bounding down the shoulder toward me. Now up close, the backpack that she was wearing made her look even younger. I noticed the mascara streaks down her cheeks and the little bruises on her arms like somebody grabbed her a little too hard. And when she got close, she thanked me with a very shaky voice and then walked around the passenger side and helped herself into the cab. Now, after I got us rolling again, the girl stayed silent in the passenger seat for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I told her that whatever ran her out there in the middle of the night was none of my business. But whatever it was, she didn't have to worry about it in the cab of my truck. She told me her name was Riley and thanked me for giving her a ride. I told her it was no problem, that I'd like to think someone would do the same if that was my daughter out there at the side of the highway. When she told me I sounded like a good dad, but that she never got to know hers, I just apologized. I didn't ask any questions, I just said the world can be a cruel place for good folks, and I was sorry her old man wasn't around for her to know. Now, I didn't know what kind of reaction I was expecting, but I sure as heck didn't expect the girl to laugh. But that's what she did. She suddenly let out this loud burst of hyena's laughter at what was supposed to be a heartfelt consolation. She'd been so quiet that the sudden outburst kind of shocked me a little, and then I stayed shocked when she told me her father was just a sperm donor, her words, not mine, and that he'd done her a favor staying out of her life. Now, I'm no shrinking violet, so I'll admit to letting out a bit of a laugh of my own upon hearing that donor line of hers. I figured that in a get tough or die sort of world, this young lady had simply gotten tough. But there was more to it than that, much more to it. I tried to change the subject away from family and ended up asking her where she was headed and if she was in school. She gave cagey answers to both and then decided to ask some questions of her own. Now, I was open and honest with her, told her where I was headed and what I was hauling. She asked what it was like being a trucker, if I slept in my truck, and if I ever got spooked staying up overnight in some shady truck stop. But then, Riley asked if I was married. It wasn't suggestive at all, just curiosity. But once again, I told her the truth and said that I'd been divorced for coming up on 5 years by that point. I put it down to how young she was, having not learned all her social graces yet. But she did not avoid the topic. Instead, she asked, "Did you love her?" And I nodded but stayed quiet, a hint that it wasn't exactly my favorite topic for small talk, and that's when Riley asked, "Did you hit her?" Now, put it down to some fatherly instinct, but my reaction as that little doozy of a question was way different than if a grown man had asked me that question. I didn't yell, I just simply told her no, and then figured the reason that she asked was because she'd seen her own father do the same thing. Riley replied that I didn't look like the type, and then there was a brief silence before she asked if I had any kids. I said yes, that I still considered myself a father, but the daughter that I shared with my ex-wife passed on about 10 years before when she was just 18. Now, I figured Riley wouldn't exactly treat the subject delicately, but I also figured maybe that was just her way. And so when she asked me, "Did you touch her?" I almost slammed on the brakes. I said I wasn't sure where she'd come from or what her story was, and neither was it any of my business, but I also advised her that questions like that, especially when asked of perfect strangers, would only invite trouble on herself. And her face turned very sad, and then she stayed quiet for a minute, almost like a scolded little girl. And it felt really uneasy, but more at the question of what in the Sam hell happened to this girl that made her so comfortable asking questions like that. Now, I stayed quiet myself, letting that question bounce around my brain as the answers got scarier and scarier. And then finally, Riley spoke again. She turned her head and with this sort of sly look on her face said, "Come on, you never once found yourself looking at her? Felt your eyes wander?" I wouldn't say I exploded, and again, it was pure paternal instinct which kept me from kicking her out of my cab. But from there on out, it was no more Mr. Nice Trucker. I asked her what in God's name was wrong with her, and told her that wasn't my kind of humor, and said if she made any more jokes like that, she'd be back on the side of the highway sticking her thumb out again. She didn't pull the scolded little girl act again. Instead, she let out another one of those hyena laughs before sighing like it was the funniest thing in the world. She told me to lighten up, that she was just kidding, and she was sadly wrong to think a road-hard trucker like me could take a goddamn joke. I told her I could take them just fine, but there were some things you just didn't joke about, and she'd do well to learn that before she pissed me off. Now, I thought that might at least silence her for a while, but instead, Riley started asking me stuff like, "Oh yeah? What's wrong, trucker? Gonna do me, huh?" And then putting on this little girl voice to ask the same question, "What's a big old trucker gonna do to a little girl like me?" Now, I finally yelled at her to shut up. If it wasn't so cold outside, I'd have kicked her out of there while we were driving. But it only took a minute of silence before she said, "I meant what I said. You don't look like the type to hit a woman." Now, I guess that lowered my blood pressure a little because I didn't feel like slamming my foot on the brake anymore. But then she hit me with, "But you do look like the type to F your daughter, pervert." Well, I just about blew a goddamned gasket. I didn't actually slam on the brakes. You can't do that in a big rig without risking some serious damage to your coupler. But I did slow us down and bring us over to the shoulder, and then once we were there, I started yelling at Riley to get the hell out of my truck. I had a snub-nosed .38 in my glove box, but this girl was tiny, so the idea of reaching for it never even entered my head. But it should have. Because just as I unbuckled my belt and opened my door, saying that I was going to drag her the hell out of the cab if she didn't climb out herself, Riley pulled a gun on me. She pulled it out of her backpack when I opened up my door and put a foot on the step. Now 1 second she was empty-handed, and the next, there it was. It looked small, like a .22 or something, but she had the drop on me, so it didn't matter how small it was. The lack of recoil on that thing meant that she could pull the trigger as often as she wanted, and the lack of recoil on it meant that it'd be a goddamn miracle if any bullet missed me. She told me to sit my ass back down in the seat and close the door. And I just briefly considered lunging for my glove compartment and hoping for the best, but I also realized that one shot to the head and it was probably game over. Now this wasn't checkers anymore. It wasn't a case of just getting that bitch out of my cab. We were playing chess now, and I had no choice but to play a long game. After climbing back into my seat, we got back on the road again. Only this time I was driving much slower because if anything happened and we went off the road, I didn't want to be driving so fast that the cab burst into flames. When I asked how far she was going, Riley, which most likely was not her real name, told me to shut up and keep driving. And this was just my anger talking, and I know that I've been better off keeping my damn mouth shut, but something slipped out anyways when I asked her, "Do you even know how to use that thing?" She told me of course she did, that her daddy taught her to shoot so she could keep herself safe from perverts like me. Again, this was her choice of words, not mine. And believe me, she wasn't saying it because of some scar that she'd had deep down. She was saying it to taunt me, nothing more, and I could hear it in her voice. When it came to knowing how to use that pistol, Riley said that I could ask the man who tried taking her to his hotel room back in Denver, who also believed she wasn't capable of using it. But the girl was also quick to add that I'd have a pretty tough time talking to him since she left him lying on the floor of that hotel room, dead as a doornail. And I noticed that she said that about her father, and since I couldn't resist, I called her out on it. I reminded her how she told me that she didn't know her father, and in response, she gave me another one of those hyena laughs. She told me I was a dumb mother effer for believing such a sob story, and that I shouldn't be so gullible in the future. I remember how she smiled when she asked if I believed her about killing a man back in Denver. I told her I'd be a fool to believe anything that came out of her mouth by that point, and once again she laughed. She said she figured I might say something like that, so she brought something along with her from Denver to prove she wasn't lying. She asked if I wanted to see, and with both hands on the wheel, I told her I didn't think I had much choice in the matter. The girl laughed, and then reached into her backpack again and pulled out a Tupperware container filled with what, at first, appeared to be mud. And when she cracked the lid and the smell hit my nose, I knew it wasn't mud. It was some type of congealed blood, and whatever was floating in it was starting to turn. At first, when the girl told me to look at what was inside, I ignored her and kept my eyes on the road. But this only made her angry. She pointed the gun at arm's length, dramatically like, so I could see it clearly. And then she said that she didn't give a good goddamn if it made us crash, because she'd scramble my brains if I didn't do as I was told, and look. Now I can't express how certain I was when she said that she was serious. I mean, this girl sounded unhinged, truly unhinged, like her sanity was holding on by just a few thin threads. I've had a gun pointed at me maybe a half dozen times in my life, but I only twice truly believed that the person would pull the trigger. Once, I was being robbed by a meth head that I described as barely human, and the other time was in the cab of my truck with that girl who wasn't named Riley. And so, since I believed wholeheartedly that she was crazy enough to risk her own life by shooting the driver of the big rig she was sitting in, I looked at what was in that container. And when I did, I almost puked. Floating in what looked like dark red jelly were two meatball-sized oval-shaped organs made of a much paler flesh. I knew what they were from the first second I looked at them, and as I stared at them for that brief moment, the smell of them turning hit my nose, and I almost lost my stomach there. I turned my eyes back to the road and kept one hand on the wheel, but I had to cover my mouth and nose with the other as I gagged to keep myself from throwing up. The girl thought that was the funniest thing she'd seen so far, and she cackled like a witch as I coughed and retched. She told me not to worry, because she cut them off of the guy in Denver after he was dead, and not before, so I wouldn't have to worry too much when it happened to me, too. And that was the most terrified I'd ever been in my life, without a shadow of a doubt, and I'm not ashamed to admit it either. I knew that the girl had lied to me once before, and just for kicks, but the evidence of what she'd done was right there in front of my face. At least, I thought it was. Because when I asked Riley if those things in the container really were what I thought they were, she started laughing again. She said they were pig testicles, and I was a coward and an idiot for thinking that they were anything else. I knew better than to say anything by that point, and I just kept on driving. And thankfully, we didn't have to go much further before the girl demanded that I pull over at an upcoming truck stop. I did as she asked, watched as she pulled her gun closer to her chest so anyone outside couldn't see it. And then before she got out, she gave me some big speech about how she normally killed a man before leaving, so they wouldn't come after her once she got out. But in her mind, I was the exception. She said that she knew I wouldn't come after her, and that I wouldn't try to hurt her either. She figured I had a gun somewhere in the cab, and she was right, but she also knew that I wouldn't use it on a girl who reminded me of the daughter I'd lost. No matter how much I hated her, no matter how much I wanted to make her pay for being such a goddamn demon, she knew I wouldn't take away her chance to live, not without feeling like the same kind of evil that had taken my own daughter away. And the worst thing, she was right. Even after she climbed out of the cab and went walking off to find her next plaything, I couldn't bring myself to do anything but drive off, praying that she'd find her way and make a decent life for herself after, whatever it was that she'd endured. I only came out from under that spell once I was about 30 miles down the highway, and I decided the only thing to do was report her to the cops. I ended up stopping at a diner and calling in the whole thing to the local sheriff's department, and they gave me a reference number that I could use when calling them back in the future, but after calling maybe half a dozen times, I heard that there was never any progress and they didn't find the girl. I still hope she found a way to get better. I don't believe anyone is born evil, but a part of me thinks that if that girl pushed her luck a little too far one day, that she might not even be around anymore, let alone getting better. When I was around 18, myself and my now husband went out to a fancy restaurant for dinner. We live in a small rural town, so the restaurant was one of those which is out in the middle of nowhere and pretty exclusive. Now, this was many years ago, and my husband's father was kind of somebody in our small town, so we managed to get a booking. Now, we turned up at around 8 and were seated, and as an 18-year-old girl who grew up poor, I felt like a darn celebrity. As the restaurant was filled with other diners, mostly middle-aged, upper-class folks who definitely looked like they belonged there. And I felt a bit like a fish out of water, but I guess this is why I was so relieved when the couple seated beside us struck up a conversation. They were clearly rich and well-to-do. The one was one of those glamorous old women who look like they're the murderous widow in some drama. And the husband, though, he clearly had done pretty well for himself and clearly enjoyed doing well for himself. His fingers were very swollen and his nose was red with these sort of burst blood vessels. And he had a very well-groomed and well-trimmed white beard and this balding head, but there were nicotine stains on his teeth and facial hair that I could see, and this was back in the days before teeth whitening made every rich person look like they had immaculate dental hygiene. I don't remember what we chatted about, and frankly, I didn't care. It was pleasant and fun, though, and they made us feel extremely welcome. Well, they made me feel welcome anyway. My husband was more used to attending higher-class restaurants like this with his family. And speaking of my husband, he stepped outside for a cigarette break. You could smoke inside restaurants back then, but we always opted to sit in the no-smoking section, because even back then it was pretty disgusting to eat your dinner surrounded by other people's secondhand smoke. My husband would typically spend about 10 minutes on a cigarette break before a meal, as he'd have a couple beforehand so he could go until after dessert for the next one. Food used to take between 30 minutes to an hour to arrive from the kitchen back then, and it was considered totally normal to wait for your meal for that long, so this was his first cigarette break. Now, a minute or so after my husband stepped outside, this rich wife excused herself to powder her nose, And I just sat there sort of playing with my cutlery and giving the rich husband a polite smile every now and then because I couldn't help notice that he was kind of looking at me a lot. And then the rich husband looked around the restaurant, leaned across the table towards me and whispered, "I love you." And then he sat back in his seat and loudly began to talk about how great this place was and said hi to another nearby group who were dining that he clearly knew. And it was so bizarre, and I almost wondered if I'd actually misheard it. I looked over my shoulder and saw my husband outside smoking, and I tried to catch his eye. Nothing doing there. Now, the wife still wasn't back from the bathroom yet, and this husband took a sip of wine, which stained his teeth red, and then he leaned towards me again and whispered, "I love you," and then went back to acting normally. His wife returned from the bathroom. My husband returned from his smoke break. 3 more times that evening, I ended up alone with this rich husband. At no point did I manage to end up alone with my husband to tell him what was going on, though. I was alone with the rich wife at one point, but she was engaged in conversation with a group of old ladies 2 tables over, and on top of that, I just felt too nervous to bring it up with her. Remember, I was literally just 18. I grew up poor, and I was surrounded by people who I could easily imagine eating someone like me just for the thrill of it. And the next time I was alone with that rich husband, he did the same thing 3 more times. Leaned in and whispered, "I love you," and then sat back with a sort of satisfied smile on his face. The second time, there were 2 "I love yous" and 1 "I really love you." Now, I was bracing myself for things to start turning weirder. You could tell from the way he was looking me up and down that pure romantic love was not exactly what he meant by his words. And the third time it was, "I love you," and then "I really love you," and then glancing around the restaurant to check nobody was looking. He directed his, and thus my, gaze to the tabletop at his waist. And I couldn't see anything, obviously, but the way the tablecloth was bunched up and the way his arm had disappeared beneath the table, he was definitely giving the impression that he was squeezing himself down there. And then he leaned across, and in the most weird and creepy whisper yet, he said it again. "I love you." And then conveniently, his wife got back to the table, and he started telling her about something that had happened at the office that he'd forgotten to tell her about, but absolutely positively had to share with her. And I just felt frozen, sick, and scared. I had no idea what to do. And of course, I had unpleasant experiences with men before as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenage girl, but you kind of expected to avoid that type of thing in this very high-end restaurant when your partner and his wife were so present. And to top it all off, I felt way too concerned about embarrassing my husband to be in front of his people. He knew some of the other diners, if not this couple themselves, and other than the weird "I love yous," the conversation with the couple had been entirely pleasant and, dare I say, even enjoyable. I would have happily befriended them if not for this creepy weirdness that was coming out of the guy. And as it happened, and at the time I believed it to be a coincidence, we finished our meal at the same time as the older couple, both paid at the same time, and both made to leave at once. My husband paid on his credit card, but the rich wife was the one to handle their bill. The rich husband sort of sidled up next to me, and I sort of froze, terrified of what he was going to say next. Instead of saying anything lewd, he just simply said it would be absolutely charming to meet myself and my partner, and perhaps we could officially dine together at some point. And then he gave me his business card. And yes, it was one that Patrick Bateman would have scoffed at, in case you're wondering. But the point is, not only did he give me his business card, but it had his home telephone number on it. The rich husband and rich wife sort of walked us to our car, and as I climbed into the passenger seat, he said, "Remember what I told you?" And when my husband looked at him sort of confused, he said that he suggested that we all dine out together again, and I had their card. But I know that's not what he meant, though. I knew that he meant the "I love yous." So that was my creepy first encounter where rich people go to dine. Was it really scary? Well, not yet, but believe it or not, this was the prelude. On the drive home, I told my husband to be everything. He is a very calm and peaceful and spiritual man. But back when we were both 18, as he's just 3 months older than me, he was, well, let's just say pretty hot-headed and protective of me in a way that verged on jealousy. And now he was so angry that he almost steered the car off the road. But I made him swear to keep him calm and listen to me, and promised that he wouldn't turn that car around or pull in and wait for the couple to pass so he could chase them down or anything stupid like that. And to his credit, he agreed with me. And then I got to the final bit, and I told him that I had the guy's business card. Now, he smiled quietly, and then when we got home, he asked me to give him the business card. And I lived with him at his mom and stepdad's house for reasons I won't go into. They were pretty bohemian about it since we were technically together before marriage. And I gave him the card after he swore me two things. One, that he wouldn't do anything for a few days until we had time to think about it. And two, he wouldn't just go around to their house, which we discovered was almost this sort of stately home. And when we swore to both, I gave him the business card. And what my husband did should have been the perfect revenge. It should have absolutely effed things up for the rich husband and revealed him for the weirdo that he is. But it didn't, and that's what creeps me out the most. What my husband did was call up the number and ask to speak to the rich wife, and it was her that he confronted. He told her all about her husband's harassment of me, and he may have embellished a little even because screw it, but he made it very clear that her husband had been trying to behave creepily towards me and hinted that I should contact him for some kind of encounter. I was listening in on the other line, as that's how landlines work those days, and I was completely chilled when I heard the rich wife start laughing in a very cold and callous way. Now, my husband-to-be kept on ranting about how uncomfortable the creepy old dude had made me, and maybe she wasn't grasping the fact that he intended to cheat on her. And this rich wife said something like, "Are you finished?" He only told her that he loved her. Gareth can be a bit much sometimes, she says. And then it hit me. Pretty much every time I'd been alone with that rich husband, my own husband had left first, and then rich wife had found an excuse to take an extended break from the table and always ensured that I was alone with her husband. Then she said one final thing that I'll never forget, which creeped me out more than any way rich husband, aka this Gareth, had made me feel. She said to my husband that maybe he should stop taking things so seriously and take them up on their offer of dinner today. And that she was sure a couple of our means would appreciate being able to dine with the likes of them. And we both looked like our company could help rejuvenate their marriage. Now, there was no doubt about it then. They were goddamn predatory swingers, maybe worse, who thought that we were just some young poor couple spending what little we had at some swanky restaurant. My husband had a tendency to dress down because he had the whole embarrassed rich kid thing, so it made some sense. And so my husband, keeping calm, said thank you for the invite, and maybe he'd check in with his father because perhaps he was familiar and maybe we could all dine together as a family. As soon as rich wife had heard my husband's father's name, she responded rather quickly that maybe we'd have to see, but perhaps it was best that we took a rain check, and then she hung up. And that was just about the one time when my husband was actually to use his birth father's reputation in our small town to scare this pair of creeps. And you can probably imagine the type of rich character my father-in-law was, given that the very mention of his name caused a pair of very creepy, probably even murderous swingers to back off in fear. But that, my friends, is a very much different story. I used to work at this trucking company out in California. Not 18-wheelers though, just regular 4-wheelers that had cold storage in the back. I worked there for 4 years, never once took a day off for any reason, and that was partly down to liking my own coworkers so much. Now, for the most part, the other drivers were a great bunch of guys. Management was another thing entirely, but all the guys down on my level were great workers, and I'm proud to still be able to call some of them friends. But then, about 5 or 6 months before I quit in protest, they hired a guy named Jerry. Jerry seemed like an okay guy at first. A little quiet maybe, but he delivered on time and he didn't have any problems with anybody. But then came what I now consider my first clue to there being something off about Jerry, and that's when Tony tried showing him a picture of his niece. She just started elementary school, and Tony's getting all teary-eyed, saying look how fast they grow up, and passing around his phone to people to show them pictures of her. But when he tries showing Jerry, Jerry just gives him this icy cold, no thank you, and then just carries on with his business. Now, Tony was really offended, actually, and he was joking when he said, it's that asshole's problem. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Even the guys who clearly didn't give a crap about Tony's niece at least took a look and said something like, she's cute, I'm happy for you. But there was Jerry acting all awkward like we were trying to show him a booby magazine or something. And like I said, I guess that was my first real clue right there. Everyone else figured that was just him. Quiet, verging on antisocial Jerry. And after a couple of months, it just drifted into the background and slipped from my mind. It only came back a few months later when I was driving back to the depot that I spotted one of our trucks parked near an elementary school, just not in the parking lot. I slowed a little, hoping to spot one of my coworkers so I could honk my horn at them, but when I did, it didn't honk. It was Jerry. And that's when I realized why his truck wasn't in the parking lot. He wasn't making a delivery. He was just standing there, watching the kids play in the yard. Now I'm thinking, what is he doing? But I didn't stop, not that first time. I figured he probably had a kid at that school, or that maybe he just delivered there and was taking a smoke break or something. But like I said, the truck wasn't in the school's lot, and I didn't remember Jerry ever smoking back at the depot. Now, this was weird, but I wasn't Jerry's boss. And I'm also not so much of an a-hole that I'd try and act like Jerry's boss. And if he wanted to goof off or do some family stuff on company time, that was his problem, not mine, and I didn't mention it to him either. But then, not even a week later, I spotted him doing the exact same thing on my day off. I was driving by the exact same school when I spotted one of our trucks in the exact same place that had been the previous week. It was like deja vu. The school, the truck, and then Jerry, right there in the same spot. That time, I had a sort of double moment of what the F, because what was he doing there a second time? But then as I slowed and watched him in my side mirror, I could have sworn that he was holding his phone up against his chest, in a way a person might do if they were secretly recording. Now, I guess I am kind of an a-hole to risk ruining a working relationship over a suspicion as weird as that. And if it turned out he was holding his phone, then whatever, I'm the a-hole. But if he was out there recording those kids, that was something that I wasn't going to tolerate. Now, I'll admit to feeling kind of crazy as I walked up to him, because after parking my car and getting out, I didn't so much as walk up as sneak up. But then there he was, holding his phone maybe 6 inches from his chest, and its screen was all lit up with what was clearly a recording of the schoolyard in front of him. And I said, "Jerry, what the hell are you doing, man?" And obviously, because he hadn't seen me, he just about jumped out of his skin before locking his phone and sliding it into his pocket. Now, he told me in that very quiet, weird voice of his, "Just taking a break, man." But I knew what I saw. And when I demanded that he show me his iPhone gallery there to prove that he hadn't been doing what I thought he was doing, he refused. Now, I was causing such a ruckus that some of the kids and one of the teachers started to pay attention to me yelling. And when Jerry realized that we had an audience now, he hopped back into his truck and just drove off with me still yelling at him. I remember calling a couple of the guys that night who told me that I should do the right thing and tell our supervisor what I saw. And so I called him and gave him the full story too. Everyone was being very understanding and saying stuff like, "What the hell? That's messed up. He's doing that on the job? Dude, get him fired." And the same was true with my supervisor, who said that he'd bring it up with management and work that slacking off on the job angle so they could actually fire the guy. My supervisor did have kind of a warning for me though, like it wasn't all smooth sailing, because when he asked if I'd taken any pictures of Jerry and I said no, he said, "Dude, really would have helped if you did, but now it's just your word against his." Now I figured that might be an issue, but like I said earlier, I put more than 3.5 years into that company, and I busted my butt every single day I was on the job too. I figured that might count for something, but it didn't. And it didn't count for a goddamn thing. I had 3 days off and I spotted Jerry on the second one, so it wasn't until a day after that I was back at work again. Now I figured I might even stroll in to see no sign of Jerry, with his locker having been emptied. But Jerry was still there, and I barely even clocked in before my supervisor said management wanted to talk to me. I knew it must have been about Jerry. There was nothing else that I was expecting it to be about, and I was right. But what I figured would be little more than a recap of my story turned out to be anything but. I was in there for like half an hour, and a lot of crap got said, but the gist of it was this. It wasn't Jerry that was in the wrong for taking pictures of kids. It was me, because I was harassing him. Okay, so management didn't exactly say that he wasn't in the wrong taking those pictures. They just didn't see it that way at all. Based on what they'd been told by Jerry, he had an interest in photography, and when I decided to violently accost him, he was standing nowhere near the elementary school in question, and neither was he facing it. Jerry claimed that I'd taken a dislike for him ever since he started, and what I was doing was nothing but an attempt to get him fired and force him out. I told management that was a lie and that me and all the other guys have been nothing but all right with him. And I also offered to get pictures of him doing his thing, just like my supervisor suggested I do, but they told me if I did, I'd be fired. Now, I say the meeting was with management, and it was more like between me and the HR guy that had been hired around the same time Jerry was. He was the one laying down the law and saying that I'd be fired if I carried on harassing Jerry, and he did it all while looking and talking at me like I was some brainless idiot. Now, I told him just because he had a college degree didn't mean that he could talk to me like that, at which point the big boss stepped in and told me to calm down. He was a good guy, so I did like he asked, but that didn't mean that I was going to take it. Since I was being treated like a nobody and management was sticking by HR and siding with that pervert Jerry, I quit that same day. I gave my 2 weeks, and I wasn't about to leave anyone in there, but I didn't want to have to work a single second more than I needed to at a company that had hired that goddamn chomo. And no one liked what was happening, but this HR guy was from corporate, and they could hire and fire just about anyone they wanted to, and often did. That meant that no one wanted to stick their head out above the clouds, so to speak. Now, I might have quit, but I kept in touch with the guys, and I've stayed friends with a few of them even all these years later. And that's why, maybe even 7 or 8 months later, I was one of the first people to hear when Jerry got arrested at work. He was a part of some FBI sting involving online child predators, as in like he thought he was talking to a 13-year-old girl when really it was some FBI agent in his 30s. And well, when I found that out, I drove straight over to that old job and almost got myself arrested when I demanded to talk to the HR guy that almost fired me for pointing out who Jerry really was. I know that was a jerk move, and I ended up apologizing to my old boss on the phone later that evening. Boy, was I fuming. And I'm actually glad that the HR guy wasn't there that day and that I didn't catch him going to his car, because I really would have ended up in jail for beating his ass. Now, the guy never showed up for work again either. My old buddy said that he quit the same day the cops showed up at work to arrest Jerry, and even though he left stuff in his desk and he didn't pick up his phone whenever they tried to call. I guess he figured that they were as mad as I was, and in one case they were. But all management wanted to do was return his stuff and do a brief exit interview over the phone, but still he didn't pick up. If there's 2 things that the whole thing taught me, it's this. Always trust your gut, and HR people are a pain in the goddamn neck. In my very early 20s, I was a waitress at a small family-owned chain in my hometown. There wasn't anything particularly notable about the restaurant. It was pretty beloved in my town, and the food was great quality. Man, our chefs were chef's kiss. And in the evenings, it had this lovely mood lighting that made the place feel incredibly romantic, even if it was a bit dark at times. I got the job after dining there with my then boyfriend, Jono, for around the 5th time, and he noticed a help wanted sign in the window. It seemed like a perfect fit since I was looking for a job for my last couple of years of college, and I already knew a bunch of the restaurant staff, either through dining there or because I was friends with a couple of the waitresses. Things went great for the first few months there. I was having a blast and genuinely enjoying the work while still finding time for my studies. Unfortunately, working at the restaurant led to a little turmoil in my life as well. There was a male coworker who I'd become good friends with, purely platonic, but my boyfriend couldn't be convinced to see it that way. And one day he turned up at closing time to catch me and my coworker Brandon at it. By at it, in this case, he meant Brandon was walking me to my car in the dark, something he did every time we worked the night shift because, well, I don't need to explain why a male friend might do that for a female friend, do I? Unfortunately, my boyfriend couldn't quite grasp this concept and he absolutely lost his goddamn mind. He accused Brandon of trying to steal his girl and then started screaming in the parking lot about all types of these STDs I had. Now, it didn't stop there either. He started coming into the restaurant during busy evening hours, pointing at me and yelling to everyone that I was a, well, loose woman, and that even more embarrassing, he was deciding that to start sharing very intimate, very true facts about my body that were just kind of things that you don't want diners at a restaurant or your colleagues to hear about, you know? It was horrible, having someone show up out of the blue to randomly yell something unpleasant about how one of my breasts was smaller than the other and I was insecure about it, or the kind of things I liked in bed. And my now ex-boyfriend was banned from the restaurant, and I was given a couple of weeks of compassionate leave. During this time, I got a restraining order filed against him, and the security camera footage from the restaurant as well as witness testimony made it pretty simple and easy of a process. But still, I was devastated. I felt like I had no choice but to quit my job because the longer I stayed, the more sick that I felt about going back to face everyone. And eventually Brandon gave me a much-needed pep talk and convinced me that I was super valued as an employee and that they'd be gutted to lose me. And his well-meaning guilt trip worked, and I eventually returned to work. And now, enter the third player in the story. His name was Howie, and he was the assistant manager of our little family. Up until this point, Howie had been polite but distant with me. Not rude or anything, but not particularly interested in me as anything more than a colleague either. And on the day that I returned to work, though, he called me into his office and told me that Jonah would not be darkening the door of our establishment again, and that he'd personally make sure of it. I wasn't sure how he could promise that since it would require him to work the exact same shifts as me, which surely he wouldn't be doing. But it turns out I was wrong. He'd arranged things so we worked at exactly the same times, at all times. And that was just the first red flag. The next, which I should have taken more seriously, was when he called me into his office again a few days later and started addressing the horrible things Jonah had said about me. He said that he knew that I didn't have STDs, Jonah claimed, because I obviously wasn't that type of girl, which isn't how STDs work, buddy, but I liked my job and wanted to keep it, so I just kept quiet on that. Now next, he started talking about how I shouldn't be insecure about my breasts. So what if one of them was smaller than the other? He'd never noticed, and in fact, he thought they looked great. And he took this as an opportunity to gesture and stare at my chest as if he was doing me a favor. And then, the third and most intolerable red flag, there had been a certain proclivity that Jonah had repeatedly yelled that I was into in front of colleagues and customers. Nothing I think anyone should be ashamed of, but not something that a young woman particularly once broadcasted to coworkers and strangers. And Howie reassured me repeatedly that it was fine that I was into this particular thing. And then he started telling me about how one of his current girlfriends, yep, phrased just like that, was also into it, and she told him that he was really good at pleasing her in that manner. And then he sort of paused as if waiting for me to respond with, I don't know. A request to experience this, I guess. The man was in his goddamn 40s, by the way, and surely he knew that that wouldn't work. And so now, I'd gone from one surprise abusive ex to a surprise creepy boss. They always say bad luck comes in threes, right? And so that night, at a bar after work, I got a bit tipsy and told Brandon everything. Brandon, who'd rapidly become my best friend, who I thought I could trust with anything. And his response, I'd probably misinterpreted Howie. That Howie was a good guy, he'd known him for years, and he'd never behaved like that towards him. Now just imagine me yelling loudly and incoherently at this point. So that was just me done with that job, but not before Howie had one final trick up his sleeve. Again, he called me into his office and this time made me sit on his side of the desk, which I reluctantly did because as much as it sickened me, I needed to part on good terms so I could get the references I needed. Now I couldn't believe what I was seeing when Howie pulled up the folder on his computer. It was a series of photos of Jono taken with a telephoto lens, like they'd been snapped by some kind of private detective, and they chronicled his daily movements since we'd broken up. Now I stared at Howie, who looked at me like he was extremely proud of himself, and he went on to explain that now we had a good enough data on Jono's day-to-day activities that we could surely make it look like an accident. Make what look like an accident, I asked. But of course I already knew. Howie had it in his head that together we were going to kill Jono to restore my honor, and then what? I dropped my panties for this balding middle management a-hole because he roped me into committing murder? Now, I told him that I severely appreciated the effort he'd gone to and asked him if he could just email his dossier over to me so I could spend the night coming up with a plan. And that buffoon actually did it. He emailed me the photos, his random, barely legible .txt documents about how we could hit Howie with a car or cause him to walk under some unstable structures, or all manner of Looney Tunes nonsense. But his most coherent idea by far was that we'd invite him to the restaurant under the guise of me wanting to get back together with him and then serve him poisoned food. I immediately called the cops and forwarded all the information. Thankfully, they took it extremely seriously and apprehended Howie that same night on intention to commit murder. Eventually, he entered into some kind of plea deal, and it was proven that he was most definitely not of sound mind. And really, I didn't care as long as he got the help that he needed and wasn't a danger to others. But for me, I was left pretty devastated. First Jono, then Howie, then Brandon. I didn't really have any close female friends, so it just felt to me like everybody I'd gotten close to had turned out to be a goddamn psychopath. And honestly, I'm still struggling to shed that belief. I'm in therapy, but every time I meet a new person, every time they're nice to me, I find myself gripped with the terror of waiting for the other shoe to drop, as they say. All because I followed up on the help wanted sign in the window of my favorite local restaurant. They say you are what you eat, but frankly I do not remember crazy being on the menu. I lived in a haunted house as a kid in the 1990s, and the activity was centered around my attic loft. There were lots of unexplained noises, objects being thrown around, etc., and there was only one event in particular that truly scared me. I could have been seriously hurt if the timing had been slightly different. Now for context, the house was built in the 1940s and it was pretty creepy. The cavernous basement and the surrounding property included, but the focus here is on the attic. The house was a traditional New England colonial with a detached 2-car garage off to the side. It sat on about an acre, with 3 sides bordered by a row of evergreens and an old stone wall. The attic was a walk-up with a full set of stairs, which split it into left and right finished sections. Now, I'm talking late 1970s puke green shag carpet and wood-paneled walls. A lot of the house had been renovated around that time in the 70s or early 80s. There were 2 panels, one at the top landing and another directly above the door at the base of the stairs behind you. These were removable wall panels that led into the slope part of the house's roofline, and those compartments were used as storage crawl spaces by my father. The left side of the stairs had a waist-height retaining wall/shelf, while the right side had a full-sized wall with a small closet accessible from the opposite side. Inside that closet was another small removable access panel for something or other, and I can't remember what it was for. I honestly forgot it was even there most of the time, but this is foreshadowing. Now anyways, my dad used the left half of the attic for his collectibles and storage, while I had free reign of the right half as my hangout spot once I got into middle school at around 1997-ish. And I spent a lot of time up there playing video games and building Legos. I had 2 chairs, a couch, a table, and I could pick up a basic over-the-air TV signal. And I hung out with a bunch of my friends up there, and it was great. Now, most of the time. Now, a quick tangent, I can recall one instance when I was probably about 5 years old, really young in any event, and my dad was going into the storage space at the stair landing to shuffle around some of his collectibles, a lot of baseball-related items, but I'm getting off topic. I crawled in there and started exploring to the right side, thinking that he was messing around on the left. And in the very corner of the attic crawl space, I saw these two incredibly intense, ice blue glowing eyes. I got this overwhelming, unexplainable feeling of fear unlike anything else, and I just turned around and booked it out of there without saying anything. And that was the only time anything like that happened while I lived there, and I'd gone into the crawl space a ton over the years. Now that the attic layout is covered, the important parts for these occurrences are the 3 removable wall panels. These things weren't just loosely put in place. They required deliberate effort to remove. I think you know where I'm going with this. And often while I'm hanging out up there, at least the panel at the top landing would pop out of its place with enough force to slide down the stairs and crash into the door at the bottom. The panels were about 3 feet tall, and there were at least that much distance between the last step and the wall. If it was the panel above the door, on the other hand, that required even less to make a ruckus. And there was only about an 8 to 10 inch ledge next to the wall on the right that you had to shimmy across to access that panel, and I remember it being about the width of a VHS tape. Naturally, when that panel came off the wall, it crashed down 10 plus feet to the base of the stairs, making a ton of noise. Now, this was the normal version of events, and it started happening more and more the longer I'd spend time up there, from 6th through 8th grade. Typically, I'd just pick up whichever panel had fallen, put it back in place, and continue whatever I was doing. And now we're getting to the meat of the story. I was sitting in my chair playing PS1 during a long gaming sesh one summer afternoon, probably in 8th grade, and the chair was positioned a few feet from the closet directly to my left. I got up to use the bathroom on the 2nd floor, since obviously the attic didn't have any plumbing. And as I made my way towards the stairs, only a couple of feet from the chair, both the panels in the stairway suddenly flew off the walls simultaneously and collided in midair, crashing down into the stairs and the door below. On top of that, the panel inside the closet shot off the wall with the same intensity, if not greater, directly into the chair that I had been sitting in. I ran down the stairs, scared out of my mind, and didn't go back up there for hours. Aside from going back there later that day to turn off the TV and PlayStation, I don't think I went back up there again for about a week. And to put it into perspective, imagine these panels leaving the walls with roughly the same force as vehicle airbags deploying, the first generation ones, not the modern stuff that isn't quite as powerful. These were 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch thick wood panels, old school material, not the cheap stuff that you get at the store today. Getting hit by one of those would have seriously messed up a grown man, let alone a scrawny 12 to 14-year-old kid. And no, it wasn't a draft or stormy weather. This happened regardless of the conditions outside. And I remember one less intense event when I picked up the panel from the bottom of the stairs, fit it snugly back into the wall, turned around, took a few steps towards my side of the attic, and it did the same thing again. And I just straight up said, "All right, I'm leaving," packed it up, and did something else in the house. I had gotten the hint. Now, most of these events happened during middle school in the late 90s when I was allowed to take over that space. We moved out when I was entering high school in 2000, and these things also occurred at other times when nobody was up there, usually at night, and I heard a lot of crap happening at all hours. My bedroom was right next to the door leading up there, under my father's side of the attic. However, the frequency of the noises and phenomena dramatically increased once I started spending my free time up there. I know for a fact that at least 2 of my friends experienced these events while they were at my house, and so did my younger brother, who was 3 years younger than me. Regrettably, I was kind of an a-hole to him around that time, and one of my friends and I locked him up there once. It was almost like the spirit had read the script because as soon as we locked him in, the panel at the top landing came off the wall. Notably, the panel directly above the door that he was desperately banging on did not come off that time, and he was screaming and crying to be let out like Michael Myers himself was up there. Now, this was a total dick move, I know, but middle school boys, what do you expect? He would have been around 10 or 11 at the time, so not super young. And to wrap things up, I drove by the place last summer and it looked like it was either being completely renovated or prepped for demolition. I got it into my head that I should talk to the current homeowners to see if they'd experienced anything similar, but I never went through with it. I drove by again earlier this summer and it looks like the renovations are done. There are visible improvements from the street and the dumpsters are gone. Still didn't find the stones to go ring the doorbell, though. Is anyone here old enough to have been a dad in the mid-90s? Well, I am, and I went through a lot during fatherhood when my 3 kids were still under 18. 2 daughters, 1 son, and I couldn't be more proud of them to this day. But I'm not here to gush over my kids. The year was 1996, my son was 5, and that Christmas he wanted the hit-hot toy that every other kid wanted, a talking 12-inch Buzz Lightyear doll. If you were a parent around then, or even a kid, you'll know how freaking impossible that thing was to acquire. Kind of rubbed salt into the wound that Jingle All the Way came out around the same year, basically portraying the same kind of struggle of a parent trying to buy an action figure. But I digress. I didn't go into a wild caper involving Sinbad, which ended up with me dressing in a full-functioning Buzz Lightyear costume. Instead, I turned to the classifieds. Worth a look anyway. People have found strange and unexpected things in the classifieds before. And so I scoured the classifieds, and sure enough, I did actually find a few Buzz Lightyears. However, the sellers were obviously asking for crazy prices. The cheapest was like $100, and the most expensive I saw was like $180, I think. Now for some context, the toy was like $25 retail, I believe, and no way could I afford that much for one single present for one of my 3 kids. It would have to be the only gift that he got, and I know that that would have disappointed him just as much as not getting one at all. Now, after a few regular store tours after work each day, I resigned myself to passing on that Buzz Lightyear. But then I saw it. A listing in that day's paper in the classifieds. A Buzz Lightyear doll for sale. $40. Of course, I figured that must have already sold, but I called the number anyway, and holy crap on a cowboy. That lovely old lady on the other end of the phone still had that doll. Now, I offered her the full $40 because I didn't want to risk anything, and the old lady explained that she'd bought the toy by accident for her grandson, having heard on the television that it was a hot new gift. But her daughter had told her it was for little kids and her grandson was 12, and so it was probably a bit too old for the toy. Now, Grandma was going to return it to the store, but her daughter and son-in-law made her list it in the classifieds, and they told her to sell it for $100, but she couldn't bring herself to profit off of it that much out of some desperate parents, so she lowered it to $40. Now, she sounded like an awesome, genuinely lovely old lady that I had no hesitation when she said that I needed to visit her home to come collect that toy because she didn't drive. Typically with exchanges like this, you're meant to meet in a public place where possible, but it really didn't seem like that would be necessary here. No spoiler, the old lady genuinely was just a lovely old woman. She wasn't luring me to cook me in her pot and eat me for Christmas. That's not where this is going at all. Now, I drove the 20 minutes over to the old lady's house and went inside. Now, it was the typical adorable old granny's home. Photos of her many familial generations on the wall, pictures of a man who'd clearly been her husband, and a worn-out single-seater that I absolutely knew her beloved had sat on every night until he passed. Now, Granny gave me a cup of something, and with it, she brought the Buzz Lightyear doll out, and it was the right one. It was perfect. It was still in the Sears bag. It must have been how she managed to find it, as Sears was downscaling their toy stock at the time, so I didn't even think to really check there. And we chatted for a bit, and then I could tell that the old woman was getting tired, so it was nearly 8 p.m., and old people tend to go to bed early. Now trust me, I'm actually one of them now. I triple-checked with Granny that she was okay with the $40, and I even offered her $50, about as much as I could afford, but she was having none of it. In fact, she tried to knock it down to $30, but I could tell that the extra $10 would be useful for an old woman during Christmas. And with the deal done, I bid her a nice goodbye, promising to stay in touch and plan to add her to our Christmas card list, and also asked my son to write her a thank you note when I told him the story on Christmas. I left the house, walked down the steps to the street, and began to head towards my car. And that's when they appeared. A gang of 3 young people. faces covered in balaclavas, wrapped up in these thick coats. And I could tell from their muffled voices that they were young, maybe even mid-teens, but that didn't make them any less menacing. They started shoving me, grabbing at the bag that I was holding, and they were asking me what I had there. Was it anything valuable? Was it worth my life? I just immediately tried to appeal to their youthful human instinct, and I explained that it was the Buzz Lightyear toy for my 5-year-old son, and I'd gone through hell to get it. Now, I expected at least an ounce of humanity or empathy at this, but no. It caused them to cackle and circle me, snatching at the bag and trying to pull it away from me. Now, I thought about lashing out. Now, back then, I wasn't some weak guy, and I could have probably done them some damage, but I was scared out of my mind that I'd get in more trouble than they would if I beat up a teenager in the week before Christmas. Eventually, they converged on me and began to overwhelm me. And then I felt a cold, strange sensation in my side. I didn't realize what had happened at first, but I remember my vice grip on the Sears bag failing and dropping the Buzz Lightyear doll. One of those youths snatched it up, and then they all looked at me, and I could see a weird kind of horror in their eyes. Why, I thought. Who the hell did that, one of them asked, and the others just shook their heads, clearly not wanting to admit to whoever it was. I was still confused. I had no idea why they were freaking out and now suddenly running away, and then I felt it. The burning, agonizing pain in my side. I reached down and touched it and felt this wetness, even though I had my wool gloves on. One of these kids had stabbed me. I'd been stabbed over a Buzz Lightyear doll. Now, I wish I could say that I chased them down and got the toy back, but instead, I collapsed in the middle of the sidewalk and began half-heartedly calling for help. Thankfully, someone had heard me pretty quickly and the paramedics arrived and got me to a hospital. Thankfully, the blade had barely entered my side thanks to the winter coat and hadn't penetrated further than the tissue and muscle. No harm, no foul, except for a few days of pain and some stitches. Thankfully, work's medical insurance covered most of it too, so it didn't even screw up Christmas financially, so to speak. And there was still the matter of letting my son down gently. I deliberated whether I should tell him that I wasn't able to get the Buzz Lightyear doll, but in the end, me and my wife decided to just tell him the truth. And so a few days before Christmas, we sat him down and explained everything. Why Daddy has an injury, and why he wouldn't be getting the Buzz Lightyear toy he wanted. I kind of expected tears and a tantrum because he was 5, but no. He was completely gracious and wonderful about it, and just said that he understood and that he'd be happy with some of the other things on his list, which was admittedly pretty extensive. And so my son never did get the Buzz Lightyear toy for that Christmas. I got a knife to the gut, but Christmas was still wonderful with the family. And then a week after New Year's, I happened to see a lone copy of the Buzz Lightyear toy sitting on a store shelf. And I guess they weren't quite so frantically in demand then. So, of course, I bought the toy for him, and finally I was able to give my son a talking Buzz Lightyear. That year, I decided to make a concerted effort to get all the kids heavily into video games because you couldn't really go wrong that way. But that one Christmas, the ugly spaceman from Toy Story nearly got me killed. Be safe out there, folks, even 30 years later. So take this with a pound of salt. I understand this is crazy and probably my brain doing some weird stuff, so yes, I know this probably all means nothing, but this has been in my brain for so long that I just gotta get it out. When I, now an 18-year-old female, was in 2nd grade, I rode the bus to and from school with my older brother, and no particular memories stand out, but a few related to this girl named Tina. And since my brother is a couple of years older than me, he sat towards the back of the bus while I sat in the middle, and a couple of random people would sit next to me in the morning towards the beginning of the year until people found the person that they wanted to sit next to for the whole year. One day, this girl that I had never seen before sat next to me, and this weird smell overwhelmed me. It was like this stale smell that didn't smell bad, but also smelled old and musty. I'm sorry, I literally can't explain it because I only recognized it when I smell it, so this Tina was a few grades above me, but other than that, nothing stood out about her. She looked like every other kid in the school, and the only thing off was the way that she smelled, because it was something that I'd never smelled before in my then 6 years of life, lol. Now, I don't remember how we became friends, but we did, and after about a week of knowing each other, she told me on a Monday that she had a secret that she had to tell me the following Tuesday. Now, I was hyped for a week waiting, and when the day finally came, she told me she was a vampire. Now, at 6 years old, I did know what a vampire was, and that they were not real and only in cartoons like Adventure Time, and so when she said this, I knew that she was lying and just sort of confused. But when I told her I didn't believe her, she said that she'd prove it to me. And this is something I'll never forget because I remember it so vividly. She told me that vampires grant wishes, which was something I had never heard about vampires, so I didn't really believe that either. But she insisted and said that if I wished to become a vampire, she would make me one, and that had proved that she was one. And so, since I didn't believe her, I agreed and wished I was a vampire, and she snapped her fingers and told me to look in the bus driver's front mirror, and since I was sitting on the outside toward the aisle, I leaned out and saw nothing in the mirror. I started to freak out, and I'm telling you, I don't know if the girl was a magician or what the frick happened, but I was not in that mirror. And so I started freaking out, and she calms me down and tells me, wish not to be a vampire. And I do. My reflection comes back in the mirror. After that, I believed her and started picking up on other details. For one, she didn't have fangs. She had those sort of lucky teeth that Kirsten Dunst has where the canines aren't sharp but stick out from the front, which kind of gave her a lisp. And she also didn't ride the bus in the afternoon unless it was raining or the sun wasn't out. And I mean that with no exaggeration. She never rode the bus on a sunny day. She seemed to be committed to the bit. And the last thing that became an occurrence was that she would regularly remind me not to tell anyone that she was a vampire, or she'd wish that I never existed. That didn't really scare me, but it was kind of off-putting. Like, okay girl, I won't. Now, something I want to mention, but I low-key doesn't really matter, is that she accused a guy in my grade named Kevin of being a werewolf. Like, okay, I guess so. So about a week after the wish thing, she told me that I could get one wish every Tuesday. And I wish I could tell y'all what I wished for, but if I remember correctly, I would tell her that I couldn't think of a wish every time for some reason. I don't know why, I just remember being like, I don't know, let me think. And then the next day I'd have a wish and she would say, girl, it's Wednesday, so no. Now I never got bad vibes from her or anything either. It just felt like I was the only one who knew her generally since no one else talked to her on the bus and we were in different grades, her being in 5th and me in 2nd. I never saw her once we stepped off the bus either. Generally, for a long time after all of this stopped, I figured that this young girl who had seen Twilight and was obsessed, but then I remember what happened the last time I saw her. The last time I saw her was a Tuesday, and instead of granting me a wish, she told me that there was a monster party happening that night, and she wanted me to sneak out of my house and come. Now, I was intrigued, but didn't really comment, so just went, okay, sure. And I asked her where it was, and she said that it had come to me in a dream because that's how vampires kept secrets. And I just kind of forgot about the whole thing once I got off the bus, since I had no intention of going anyways, since I was literally probably 5 or something. Now anyways, after forgetting about it all day, when I went to sleep that night, I had a crazy dream. I dreamed that I was at a party, and there were so many stereotypical monsters there. They weren't exaggerated to be scary, they literally looked like they were 1900s movie counterparts as I walked through the room, so it just looked like a bunch of monsters drinking from red cups like I saw on TV. And as I walked through, I saw a vampire who looked like Dracula. Pale skin, widow's peak, long fangs, and cloak. And as I walked through to reach him, I noticed that there was this big hole in the middle of the floor that looked like a cliff behind him. And when I got to him, he said something to me that I remember for a long time but recently forgot. And it was nothing scary though, just sort of a remark saying, "Oh, you've made it," or something along those lines. And as we were talking, he moved in a way that I followed to hear what he was saying, not realizing that he was turning me around so that the cliff was now next to me. And at some point I ended up slipping and holding onto the cliff with both hands, begging for him to let me up, and he just stood there for a bit. There was no urgency in the dream at all. From me asking for help to him not moving to help, it all felt very calm. And eventually he bent down and started to lift my fingers up so I wasn't gripping the cliff until I eventually fell to my death. And now the way my dream works is that they play out like a movie. So they're not in first person, and while I never see my own face, I see various perspectives. And so I felt it was as if a camera watched me go down and hit the ground. The dream didn't end when I hit the ground either, it kind of stayed and I saw myself on the ground dead. Now, it was so surreal to think about because it was so randomly graphic and nothing surrounding my interactions with her before that ever gave anything sinister, besides her last interaction with me leading up to the dream. And after that night, I never saw her again, and weirdly, it took me a couple of years to realize her connection to my dream. That smell has never left me, and neither has that dream since I never remember my dreams and can only recount like 5 I've ever really had. And I occasionally get reminded of this whole thing when I meet someone who smells like her, which has been maybe 4 times since. Overall, she probably wasn't a vampire, but between the bus mirror thing that actually did happen, and I can't refute, and the crazy dream, I don't know. I know the mind can make up some crazy stuff, but I remember anything down to a T like that, and I really don't know what to say. I'm not religious and have a difficult relationship with the paranormal stuff, and whether I believe in it or not, but that's probably something I'll post about later. Hey Joel and crew. Do any of you remember that huge, horrific blizzard that happened in Oklahoma way back in 2009? I got caught up in it, if that's not obvious. I was driving home from a remote Christmas party on Christmas Eve when the snow really began to fall. What reception I could get through the radio was telling everyone to stay indoors and definitely for sure don't go out driving in your cars. Well, thanks. That really helps halfway through my journey. Now, eventually the snowfall got too heavy and I couldn't risk driving. I tried to pull into what seemed to be a safe side bank, but in fact was a snowdrift that tipped my car into a ditch. Within seconds, the whole car was covered in a blanket of white. Did you know the blizzard reached a record 14 inches of snow that year? Imagine being out in that. And so there was no point trying to gun the engine or pull myself out of the ditch. The car was kind of just sort of sideways at an angle, firmly stuck, and of course, I had no cell reception in the middle of a blizzard out in the sticks. Now, I was gonna die in my car on Christmas Eve, I thought. I thought about my boyfriend waiting at home for me and the late night that we had planned, and I just sort of sat there and wept. He worked as a paramedic, so he hadn't attended the party with me as he didn't want to call off of work on Christmas Eve, and I was gonna let him down by dying like a moron instead of spending Christmas morning in his arms. My teeth began to chatter, and I found every possible wrap, blanket, and piece of material I could in that car to wrap myself up in. I allowed myself occasional blasts from the heater, but I didn't know how long I'd need to conserve the battery, and I had to be careful with this. Whenever I turned the heating on, it would melt the snow on the windows just a little, and it felt like I was there forever. Hours, days, weeks. I drifted in and out of consciousness. One time I woke up and I was shivering so bad that I thought that I was going to bite my own tongue off. Now, I allowed myself an extra long gun of that engine and the burst of the heater then. Gradually, the snow melted off the windows. And I can't tell if I fell asleep again, but I had this distinct memory of seeing someone outside in the snow. They were wrapped in deer skins and just sort of prowling the forest. I know it had to be a dream, but you know when a dream feels like a dream? This didn't feel like that. This deer figure stalked through the trees, and they'd clearly noticed my car, but were pretending they hadn't. I banged on the window, shouting for help, but unable to open the door and too afraid to wind the window down in case the snow burst in and buried me. Now, eventually, this deer-clad figure did approach the window, tapped on it, and then just ran away. All I can remember is some dirty human face. I think I must have been delirious because I have no explanation for this at all, and this wasn't like the middle of nowhere, Finland. It was Oklahoma. I decided the heat was getting to me, so I just shut it off, but I still felt too hot, so I started removing the blankets and coverings that I had on. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered that this was a symptom of hypothermia, that people become convinced they're too hot but not too cold. And I began drifting, and eventually a choir of angels descended from the heavens, glowing golden and silent through the blizzard. Except it wasn't a choir of angels, it was a rescue truck, and they were here to freaking save me. Now, I won't describe the boring, elaborate process that involved getting me out of my car into one of those shiny thermal blankets and then taken to the hospital with a severe case of hypothermia. So, that's how I spent Christmas Day that year, in a hospital, making sure that I had enough fluids and didn't go into shock. My paramedic boyfriend didn't leave my side and brought me some of my gifts to my hospital bed. And it was actually one of the best Christmas days ever because the night before, I was certain that I was dead. And not being dead in a ditch is one of the best Christmas presents you can ask for. At 1:52 a.m., my phone rings. It's my husband. He had already texted me, letting me know that he was on his way home from work. Worried that something was wrong, I answer. I say, "Hey babe, you okay?" And there's silence. "Babe? Can you hear me?" "I can now, are you okay?" I respond. I don't know what just happened. I'm almost home, but I saw something. I'm about to lose service. Be waiting on me, please." I get out of my bed and stand at the front door waiting to see his headlights come down our long driveway. He gets in the door with a shocked look on his face, and this is what he says to me. I saw these things. These tall, white things. A tall, white woman with two other tall, white people. Not white like skin color, like snow white. They were standing out by the abandoned train tracks. The woman had what my brain could only compare to a trash bag with light. I know that's not what it was, but that's what it reminded me of. When I saw them, they noticed me too, and I just got this feeling. I can't explain it, but I just need to get out of there. It's like an unease came over me. I'm not sure what they were, but it wasn't right. They're not humans. Now, I started reheating his dinner, and then it hit me. This automatically made me think of the tall whites. Now, I Googled tall whites and asked my husband if any of the photos were comparable, and he scrolled to one image and said, "Yeah, this is close." Now, the next morning, we decided to go back to where he saw them, and there was a black mark on the ground, like something scorched the earth. Now, even more puzzling was that it had lightly rained the night before, and it was raining when he saw them. Nobody lives in the area where he saw them. It's just an old one-lane road that connects to two larger roads and crosses the abandoned railroad tracks. We also live in the outskirts of a very tiny little town. It's unlikely that anyone was this far out, making a fire directly next to the road and tracks. And as we're walking towards the car, an old man in a beat-up old Ford pulls up beside us. Now he says, "Hey, what are y'all up to?" Neither of us recognized him, and we just nodded and said, We're just looking at something. Is our car in the way?" Now he puts the truck in park and gets out, and he says, "No, y'all are fine. Did you kids see something interesting?" And my husband responds, I saw something out here the other night on my way home from work. I'm not sure what it was, though." And the old man says, "Is that right? I live over that way. Have all my life," as he points to the highway. An awkward silence falls over us for a few seconds as we're walking to the car. And then he says, "Y'all believe in aliens?" My husband and I both look at each other. I say, "Yes, actually we do." And he goes on to tell us that he and his wife, his late wife, experienced a lot of strange occurrences over there over the years. Now, he said the scorch marks were from them, and asked if we'd ever seen anything in the sky that was unidentifiable. Now, my husband showed him a video that was taken a couple of months back of an unidentified flying object over our house. He invited us over to his house, saying that he had some images that he'd like to show us. And it may not have been the best decision, but we agreed. Now, my husband actually has his carry permit, so I wasn't too worried if anything weird went down. Now, we followed him to this old farmhouse, and he said his grandparents built the house back in the 1800s, and all of them had seen and experienced things on and around that property. He goes to a little garage/shack and retrieves some old Polaroid pictures, all 5 photos picturing your classic flying saucer. "My father took these," he said. "There's more in the house somewhere." And he goes on to tell us that he's not exactly sure where they come from or why they're here, but he knows there's different species and different kinds of crafts. Now, I'd like to think that we gained a friend, but I'm still not 100% sure what my husband encountered. I just thought I'd share this story here and see if any of you think it's connected. So I'm actually the son in the story, and it was a tale my dad told me many times from when I was a kid. I'm gonna write it from his perspective as he dictates it to me though, because it makes more sense listening to it from his point of view. And I asked him to write it down for me, but he said, "I'm not writing out all that crap for some Facebook Minecraft pod channel nonsense." He's 65 now, and I have no idea how he knows what those things are, but I just told him that I'd write it out for him. And he also cannot get his head around the fact that you are not Markiplier and that other YouTubers exist, so I'm writing it exactly as he dictates here. So anyways, hi Markiplier or whoever you are. This happened back in the day. Our family stupidly decided that we wanted a real Christmas tree that year. Now trust me, don't bother. It's messy as crap and, well, I guess it could lead to the kind of thing happening that happened to us. We drove out to a certain national forest. Me, the wife, and this little bastard here writing this all down. Now please note, I love my son very much, I just like giving him a bit of crap here and there. And so we were just going through the national forest when I found it, the perfect tree. Out came the axe and I began swinging like a woodsman out of old. Paul Bunyan would have been proud of me, whacking and thwacking away at that tree trunk like a pro. And suddenly, I heard a sound. A sort of spluttering, horrified scream of, "What the F do you think you're doing?" A big, fat, older couple came waddling their way through the trees, dressed up in winter gear. The man was red-faced from exertion and years of enjoying a bit too much to drink. He pointed one fat, bloated finger into my chest and told me I was not, I repeat, not, allowed to cut these trees down. I replied that in fact I was allowed to cut these trees down, and this part of the forest allowed it. And I even produced the necessary paperwork proving it. Now in fairness, not everyone knows that certain parts of certain national forests allow you to cut down Christmas trees, so I came prepared. The man took the paperwork from my hands and instead of looking at it, he threw it down into the snow and just stomped on it, like some stupid toddler. Now my wife was seeing red. I'm the calm one of the two of us, but she comes up to this guy and started giving him an earful. How dare he lay hands on her husband, and how dare he accuse us of false crimes? Now, he began to stutter and my wife continued to yell at him, now for getting spittle on her face. Every insult you could think of she was throwing at this angry old busybody. Now I looked around for my son to check that he wasn't too upset by this whole ordeal. I didn't see him. Nor, I realized, did I see the fat wife of the angry man. I scanned the forest, and there they were in the distance, the egg-shaped woman waddle running away, holding my son's hand and dragging him along. I'm not entirely sure what she told him to persuade him to go with her, but he wasn't trying to pull away or anything. The husband realized that I'd noticed what was going on and tried to step between me and the view of his wife kidnapping my son. Well, no, I obviously wasn't having that. And without even stopping to think about the potential repercussions, I punched the fat husband in the face so hard that it sent him flying across the snow, smacking against a tree and collapsing to the ground. I was probably going to be in some trouble here, I figured. And then I remembered this was a plot to kidnap my son, so I was pretty sure a punch was fair game. I sprinted towards the woman dragging my son away. It was hard work in the thick snow, and somehow this chonky woman was faster than you'd expect. I was faster though. I grabbed the back of my son's coat and swung him behind me, throwing him backwards onto the snow. And then, determined not to let this kidnapping heifer get away, I drew on my old high school football days and tackled her in the back as hard as I could. Maybe too hard because we went flying forward and her face connected squarely with another tree, knocking her out. I dragged her back to where my wife had somehow tied the husband up to a tree with the ties that we'd bought to attach the tree to the car roof. The wife was out cold, but the husband was just sort of muttering that we got this all wrong, that they just didn't want us destroying the forest. And the forest where it was perfectly legal to farm a Christmas tree, mind you. Sure, buddy. That's why your pig of a wife tried to steal my son. And this was days before cell phones, so my wife and son drove to the nearest convenience store while I just sat guarding the couple. We had no more restraints for the wife, so I kind of just sort of sat on her, which was not pleasant to say the least, and thankfully, she didn't regain consciousness. Eventually, my wife returned with the cops, and the couple were squeezed into the police cruiser, and I'm actually surprised they fit. Ultimately, nothing came of it, though. It was their word against ours, and according to the cops, they were willing to overlook the numerous assaults that I'd committed against them as long as we accepted that it was all a big misunderstanding. We didn't have a choice, really. No way was I going to prison and depriving my son of a father just to fight a losing battle. I do worry sometimes that that couple had done this before and did it again, but there's so much evil in this world and only so much of it that God-fearing folk like us can fight. And I hope you enjoyed my little story, Markiplier, and you read it on your radio show or whatever you weirdos do. Thanks for listening, and remember, don't be afraid to tackle a fat woman if she's kidnapping your son. Dad out. And so there we go. That was my dad's story. I have vague memories of it, really, so I know he's mostly telling the truth. I have this slight recollection that the woman promised to take me to see Santa and I somehow fell for it, but I don't like to dwell on that. The idea that I was that stupid as a little kid is almost harder to cope with than the fact that I was nearly kidnapped and probably eaten or whatever they were going to do to me. So there's this woman, Paula, we'll call her. She's maybe 5'4", 85 pounds, originally from a country in South America, and freakishly strong. I used to take yoga with her, and we did aerials and pole together. And she's also nearing 60, but you would never guess. She's so fit and tiny and almost ageless in this very intense, wiry, even vibrant way. But I've never quite known what to make of her. I wouldn't say that we were close, though for a little while we started to get closer because we were around each other a lot. The thing is, she started subtly mirroring me. Doing her hair like mine, painting her nails the same color, styling herself in ways that felt oddly specific. She even bought me clothes, and it didn't feel like some sweet gesture. It felt off, like she wasn't admiring me, she was trying to wear me or be me. And then one day, we were at open pole together with one other person there, and the studio doesn't have dim lighting, it's actually very bright and fluorescent. And when she was doing this sort of sideways pole sit, and I could feel her watching me. We are both extremely flexible, but I have this sort of connective tissue disorder, so I have a slight edge on her, which isn't a big deal, but she is extremely competitive, probably even a covert narcissist. Now anyways, I'd just done something kind of splitty, and as I turned around to smile at her because it felt like she was looking at me, and when I did, her eyes were completely black. I mean, fully black. I looked for several seconds because I couldn't look away. She just seemed almost vacant. Not checked out, but absent, like she'd gone somewhere momentarily and she was temporarily checked out. But yet it also felt like there was something in her place, an almost energetic placeholder. Something else seemed to be looking out through her, but it wasn't necessarily an intelligent being. I was left with this feeling of, I don't think I was supposed to see that, and I'm pretty sure she doesn't know that I saw this, but also I don't know if she was even aware of something happening. It was like when you accidentally see a mic in a movie or a crew wearing jeans in a film set in ancient Rome. It wasn't just a weird lighting thing. Again, bring fluorescent lights at the studio, or a blink. It was just unmistakable, and I've never seen anything like it before or since, and I'm also pretty positive nobody else saw it. Now, it only lasted a few moments. I finally stopped looking at her and walked over to the table where my stuff was and took a sip, and then everything was just sort of back to normal. Now, I know how this sounds. I try to rationalize it and gaslight myself into letting it go, but I can't. Not with everything else. The mirroring, the vibe, the way I never felt entirely at ease around her. I'd really love to hear what other people might make of it, because I honestly don't know if I'm reading too much into it or not enough. So many years ago now, I worked in a little craft store, and it was coming up to Christmas. Now, this was always a lovely, busy time for the store, and we'd done extra well that year. We all decided to run a potlucky Christmas party, and the assistant manager, Janine, volunteered to host the festivities at her house. All good, all grand. Now, 4 weeks before the event, we received emails from Janine planning, maybe over-planning, the meal, and we all decided what we were bringing, making sure everything would be perfect, etc. Now, one constant in every single email that she sent was the strong emphasis that Janine was allergic to peanuts, like fatally, deathly allergic. And we all had to promise repeatedly that we would make sure that our dishes weren't contaminated by peanuts in any way. Not a problem given the dishes that we were preparing. The big day came, and the spread was fantastic. The 8 of us sat around Janine's extending dining table talking about, excitedly, the great year that Carol's Crafts had gone through. Now, Carol, the big boss, was already a little drunk when she got there via her cab, which was wild to see. It was like seeing your grandma tipsy. Janine's husband set up the table for us and laid out all the food and then vacated the premises. Going out drinking with the boys, apparently, he said. So it was just the 8 of us, the full staff of Carol's Crafts. 7 women and 1 guy named Bruce, who was the absolute spitting image of Freddie Mercury back in that era, just very campy and bisexual. He was the joker of the group and had the rest of us women howling with laughter at some of the crazy dating stories from back when he lived in New York City. Now, none of us noticed the oddity about the spread at the table. I won't ruin it by giving it away just yet, but there was something that we should have all picked up on, and none of us did. We were having too much of a good time listening to Bruce's stories and chattering among ourselves, and we barely even begun to eat. When we did, though, the food was delicious. Everyone had outdone themselves. Compliments were being thrown left and right, fun was being had by all, right up until Janine started coughing, and then choking, and then her face began to swell. It was obvious what was happening. She'd ingested peanuts somehow, and she began to claw at the table, reaching for water, trying to croak out the word EpiPen, but we had absolutely no idea where she kept that EpiPen in her house. Suddenly, Carol was on her feet, reaching into her purse and producing an EpiPen out of nowhere. Later, she'd claimed that she'd always carried one with her, as the boss, knowing that one of her employees had a peanut allergy. So without any fuss or hunting for an EpiPen, Carol shot Janine up with the epinephrine, and immediately the effects were obvious. She started being able to breathe again, and the swelling stopped. That wasn't enough, though, so we called 911, and an ambulance was there in minutes, and she was taken to a hospital and treated. And that wasn't the end of it, though. Long story short, the doctors discerned that Janine had fully consumed peanuts, and that her reaction had been far too bad for minor contamination. That meant that one of the dishes that she'd eaten had contained an actual large amount of peanuts. Janine insisted on getting the cops involved because, after the repeated numerous warnings, it felt like an attempt on her life. I can't blame her. It was determined that the meatloaf contained ground-up peanuts, and more than enough to be deliberate. But therein lay the big mystery, and the thing that we hadn't noticed throughout the whole meal. The potluck should have consisted of 8 dishes, and there were 9, and all of us denied bringing the meatloaf, and we all explained which dish was ours. Now, time passed and we went back to work after the Christmas break. Janine kept dropping comments and remarks suggesting that she believed one of us had brought the meatloaf as well, and then we started suspecting each other. Had Bruce finally gotten sick of Janine's OCD and how the shelves were stacked? And what about Carol? She conveniently had an EpiPen on her person despite having no need for one. Was it really just a thoughtful gesture for an employee, or had Carol merely wanted to ensure Janine didn't die but let the allergy serve as a warning? And then there were all the other staff members. None of us had a problem with Janine, and we were all like family, but someone had certainly tried to harm or kill her. Carol's Crafts wasn't the same after that. We all suspected each other, and just when it felt like we'd moved on, someone would bring up the peanut meatloaf and would all start again. And this broke Janine. She started referring to us as potential killers and talking openly to herself in the break room about how her colleagues wanted to end her. In the end, Carol had to ask to leave, and honestly, we were all kind of relieved after that. Maybe that would be the end of it. But then Carol gathered us all in for a meeting and told us that as sorry as she was, it was weighing on her too. She explained that she'd gathered enough of a nest egg to retire, and that the stock was being sold off to another craft store in a different state, and there would be no new owners, and Carol's Crafts was closing for good. I suppose when you're all surrounded by an attempted murderer, it's inevitable. We never did find out which member of Carol's Crafts tried to kill Janine, and before you groan at a lack of conclusion, that's because the answer was none of us. Maybe you've worked it out already, but the culprit was Janine's husband, Paul. He'd prepared the table for us while we all had drinks in the living room, and this included secretly heating up a meatloaf he'd prepared earlier while Janine was at work, into which he'd crushed dozens of peanuts. His plan, we found out, had been to try and kill his wife and make it look like it was one of Janine's colleagues. Now, we found this out via a very long apologetic email that Janine sent us all some years later. She explained everything. Paul was now her ex, and in one of their final blazing rows, he'd let something slip about the meatloaf. It wasn't enough to bring any kind of charges against him, unfortunately, but she did include potentially tried to poison me with peanuts in the divorce proceedings, so there's that. No idea what Paul, Janine, and Bruce or any of the rest of us are up to now. I do know that Carol retired to Florida and passed away during the pandemic, ironically by being hit by a bus and not the virus, according to Facebook, but I wish them all the well. Now, I'll just say one thing. There's no way that I'm having a potluck Christmas meal with any of them ever again. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was laying in the front bedroom of my great-grandparents' large home my mother inherited. And there was an entire upstairs apartment not being used, and it was a large 3-bedroom home on the first floor. Upstairs were 3 more bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom. My mom was about to rent the upstairs out, but saving it for a relative whose lease was up. And my mom and her entire family grew up in that home. And by this time, my great-grandparents had passed on, but my grandparents were still alive. Now, I often watched television in bed with my mom when I was that young and would either fall asleep in her room or go to my room, which was closer to the back of the home. Now, it was Friday night, so I was allowed to stay up late. At around 11:30 p.m., we heard a very loud noise of someone entering the home through the back door. Now, you have to pass through the dining room, living room, and kitchen to get to the back of the home, and you cannot see the back door until you've reached the kitchen. My mom grabbed her gun, and I remember grabbing a metal candle holder, and she told me to stay in the room and hide, but I refused. I wasn't going to let her go alone, and I was scared, so I trailed behind her with my weapon. My mom had her gun drawn, making her way to the back room, ready to blow someone's brains out, and when we reached the back room, the room was glowing. We only saw it for maybe 2 to 3 seconds, and then it went pitch black. And after the glow went away, we saw the back door wide open with a men's size 12 mud print on the door where someone had kicked it in, and there was no one in sight. When my mom tried to call 911, the phone line was dead, and we later found out that it had been cut. She had a panic button that alerted the police in the front room, and the alarm had not yet been set, but the button actually worked. and help came within 6 or 7 minutes. This happened in 1994, over 30 years ago. However, I have always believed that someone came there with the intentions of doing us harm, and I also believe when they kicked down that door, they saw something that scared the life out of them, and they took off running. I believe it was our relatives protecting us in that family home. I saw the glow clear as day, and it was almost this purple color, almost like a lit gas pilot on a stove would look like, and my mother saw it as well. We never talked about the glow until I got older, and she never mentioned it to anyone, I don't think. And we had the conversation when I was about 20 and talked about the glow, and she looked at me in complete shock and said, "Oh my God, you saw that too." So I'm a woman in my mid-20s. Usually I live with my boyfriend, but he was away for work, returning home on Christmas Eve. And this story takes place a few days before Christmas Eve. I was just chilling around the warm, single-story house in my PJs, and the place was decorated for Christmas, and I was excited for my boyfriend to finally get home on Christmas Eve and see it. Now, I'm not sure exactly what I was doing when I first heard the noise, probably watching some crap on Netflix, but I heard what definitely sounded like footsteps on the roof. Now, you know how it's not at all weird to hear strange noises around a house. Buildings, new and old, can shift and settle, especially when the temperatures change. Plus, there could be squirrels hibernating in the roof space. Even a single-story house has one. And whatever, bros, as long as you don't bother me, I'll let you warm yourselves up there. Now, my friend called, and we were chatting and gossiping about various crap, including whatever show I was watching on Netflix, which makes me think it was probably 10 Reasons Why, because I remember I was complaining about it so much that my friend laughed at me for raging like I was on Twitter. And then I just happened to mention the footsteps that I'd heard on the roof earlier, and she joked that maybe it was Santa coming early and he was gonna slide his sack down my chimney. Now, we chatted a bit more and hung up, and I went back to watching my crappy show, and then I heard it again. Definite footsteps on the roof, though, it seemed. And it sounded like someone was sort of pacing back and forth, and then at one point running around almost in a circle. What the hell, I thought. Now, wrapping myself up in my winter coat, I went outside to see if I could see anyone or anything on my roof. Of course I couldn't, but then being a 5'3" woman, I could barely see the roof in the first place. I would have had to get a ladder out of the garage, and there was no freaking way that I was doing that in snowy weather, just in case there was a dude on the roof. Besides, what could he actually do on the roof? So I just went inside. Big mistake, though. The guy on the roof must have seen me, even if I hadn't seen him, and this apparently sent him into a frenzy. It was like he was running around on my roof like some maniac, doing laps or whatever, but why? I have no idea. But it was incredibly unsettling and terrifying, and very scary since I was home alone. So this guy did not stop running around up there for a good half hour, which caused me to go out again and look. Now this time, I saw him. He was wearing a filthy Santa suit and had the build of a meth addict. And he saw me too, and he pointed right at me. Then he started shrieking about how I was on the naughty list, and that's why he'd been running around on my roof for the past 2 hours. When I thought about it, I had no idea how he'd even gotten on my roof. It's not like he could climb up onto it without a ladder, and the ladder was definitely in the garage. The only thing that I could think of is that he'd somehow taken a running jump from a neighbor's roof and managed to make it. Either that, or he actually was Santa, I guess, but that would mean that Santa was a filthy, emaciated meth head with rotten teeth and a bizarre roof exercise regime. Thankfully, I had my cell in my coat pocket, so I pulled it out and dialed the cops right in front of him, keeping eye contact with him the whole time. I guess there was a danger that he could have leaped off the roof at me and somehow avoided injuring himself. Or as I thought of later, he could have thrown something at me, but thankfully I didn't consider that at the time. Plus, with how cracked out this guy obviously was, I'm pretty sure that he couldn't have hit a barn door with a banjo. And when I got off the phone with the cops, I told Meth Santa that they were on their way. And he sort of paused, thinking about this for a moment, and then started doing laps around the roof again. And I watched in shock as he ran in circles faster and faster, and then eventually charged towards my neighbor's roof and did a front flip as he jumped across the gap. Now, to his credit, he made it too. Meth Santa was some parkour expert apparently, and I watched as he sprinted around the roofs, leaping further and further. And when the cops got there, I told them roughly where he'd gone, but I was kind of in shock. It's not every day that you see a methed out Santa doing parkour across your neighborhood. Now, I went back inside and kept watching out the window, and about 30 minutes later I saw a squad car driving past with that Santa in the back, looking pretty sad. And shortly after, there was a knock on my car and a kind lady cop explaining the whole situation. The guy was known as a local crack and meth head, and according to him, he was sick of being a bad person, so he wanted to be Santa. But he couldn't afford any gifts, so his plan was to just run around on some roofs and let people think Santa was real. I guess it was kind of sweet in some way, and that was until he admitted dropping some baggies of probably cocaine, but I don't know how good it was, down the chimneys to some of the houses, and I was glad that I didn't have a chimney. And when I asked how they'd finally caught him, the cop just sort of laughed. He said that despite his mad skills jumping around, his eyesight clearly wasn't that great, because after one particular epic leap, he'd run headfirst straight into a chimney and knocked himself out. And then the cops and the fire department had brought him down, checked him over with the paramedics, and then carted him off to the local police station. I have no idea what became of him, and I'm not sure what kind of crime it is to freely drop baggies of probably dirty cocaine down people's chimneys as a Christmas present, but I hope he got the help he needed. When my boyfriend returned, I told him the story, and he thought it was the funniest thing ever, after refusing to believe me for about an hour. And he was hugely disappointed that he didn't get to see the fun for himself, but despite that, and despite my visit from Meth Santa, I still managed to have a great Christmas. And this year, I hope you all do too. Just remember, if you hear footsteps on the roof, it might be the jolly fat man, or it might be a crack addict. These days, you just never really know. From the time I was 7 years old until I was 12, my family lived in the front house and my aunt lived in the back house. From her living room, I could see out the front door. I began to notice that almost every night, I would see an older man wearing brown mechanic overalls and carrying a lunchbox stop at our front door. He would pause as if he were unlocking it and then enter the house. I told my aunt about the man, and she told me to let her know about it the next time I saw him. The following night, she was watching with me when I saw the man walking up our driveway. I called my aunt and we went outside. I asked her if she saw him, and she said that she did. We walked to my house and watched as the man stopped at the door, unlocked it, and entered the house. We followed him as he walked into the kitchen and placed his lunchbox on the counter. He turned around, almost facing us, and then disappeared. This happened for years until I decided to ask our neighbors, an elderly couple that all the neighborhood kids called Grandma and Grandpa, who had lived in the house before my family moved in. Grandpa asked me why, and I told him I was just curious. He told me that a man named Kenneth had lived there, and he was a mechanic and had a garden in the backyard that he loved. I asked why he moved out if he loved the house so much, and Grandpa told me that Kenneth was coming home from work one night when he died in a car accident. He never made it home. I said that was sad and that I hoped that he hadn't gone through any pain. Grandpa said that he passed instantly as soon as the two cars collided. I told my aunt what Grandpa said about Kenneth, and she told me that maybe I should talk to him about it. I was 12 years old and had been seeing this man for years. He never scared me, so I decided to try. He usually showed up at around 6 p.m., so I waited at the front door for him, and when he walked up the driveway, I spoke to him. I said, "Hello, Kenneth. You had an accident and never made it home from work. My family lives in your house now. You're free to keep coming back here every night, but there's a beautiful garden waiting for you on the other side. You're free, and I know that you miss your garden." Kenneth looked at the house and then down at the ground and then up at the sky. He disappeared for the last time and we never saw him again. I told my grandma and grandpa what I had done, and Grandma said that she had seen him walking down the street, but he always looked right through her. He heard you. He saw you, she said. And that is a very special thing. Don't ever forget that. I won't say which company I used to work for, but it had multiple departments, and each department had an office to itself. My department would always do a Secret Santa, and every year it was awesome. And that was until 2015, when the guy assigned to buy my gift was the new guy, the office creep, and I'll just call him Crispin. Now, of course, I had no idea it was Crispin who was buying my gift. That was the point. In fact, we weren't supposed to find out until we took our gifts home, opened them, and then revealed who bought for who the next day at work. Now, I'd been assigned Margaret, this elderly woman who'd been at the company for years and who loved bath bombs and things like that, so she was an easy buy. Being a young woman in her mid-20s, I figured that I'd be easy to buy for as well. My Secret Santa gift felt like a framed picture, and I could feel glass on one side as I gently tapped it. Now, it was pretty poorly wrapped, with a very fragile sticker stuck to the front, and I made sure to be careful getting it home. When I arrived home, I had various things to deal with, like breaking up with a guy that I'd met on Tinder who seemed cool at first but soon became way too clingy and obsessive. And I put on my big girl pants and broke up with him over the phone instead of text message or email because I at least owed him that. And then I had a glass of wine to calm my nerves, and by the time I remembered my Secret Santa gift, I was in kind of a melancholic but floaty mood. And when I opened it carefully, I thought that I was seeing things. It was a framed photo depicting a young, attractive couple on a beach. The man was wearing a Speedo that left very little to the imagination, and the woman was wearing one of those hideous micro bikinis, neon pink I might add, and that left even less to the imagination. And you know the ones where the parts covering your naughty bits are clearly kinda see-through, so you're basically skirting the line of being naked? Yeah. And fair enough what people want to dress like though. But the horrifying part was the fact that my face had been photoshopped extremely badly onto the micro bikini chick's neck. Now, I'm a pretty pale girl, my hair's almost black, and this model was clearly a bronzed blonde bombshell. No attempt had been made to make our skin tones match or anything else for that matter, and in fact, I could still see a bit of her hair sticking out behind my own head. And even this was the most horrific thing though. The horrifying thing was that Crispin from work had been photoshopped over Speedo Hunk's head. And this had to be a joke, right? A somewhat cruel prank from one of the girls since they'd been a little bitchy about Crispin. Now, I was less convinced it was a prank when I noticed that his signature was in the corner of the photo though, written in Sharpie, although of course that could be faked as well. Now, feeling kind of upset and sick about it, coupled with the earlier events of the evening, I left the weird photo on my desk knowing that I'd find out the culprit tomorrow at work. And it was as bad as you'd expect. We all gathered together that lunch break with the reveal of who'd bought gifts for who, and as much as I'd hoped and prayed it wasn't the case, mine was from Crispin. And when he asked if I'd liked it, with genuine sincerity in his voice and on his face, what the hell was I supposed to do? Realistically, I know that I should have reported him to HR or just chewed him out, and I should have shown the Photoshop to my colleagues, although I felt weirdly embarrassed to do so. But Crispin outranked me in the company, and he was friends with the boss above, and he had this look of an eager puppy on his face when he asked me if I liked the gift. And so I did the dumbest thing I could. I said that it was sweet and thoughtful. And when it came time to show off our gifts to each other, I pretended like I'd forgotten it at home and described it as a photo of Crispin and I, and then left it at that. I know I made a stupid decision by letting this slide. Trust me, I really do. You're probably screaming at your phones or TVs or wherever you listen right now about what a dumb idiot I was, and yeah, I do agree. But it was just such a weird left field incident that I could barely work out what to do, say, or even think. That night, I dismantled the photo. I didn't want to toss the whole thing out because it was in a bizarrely high-quality frame, and I figured that I could use it for something that wasn't massively creepy and weird. No, I was almost expecting some kind of message to be written on the back of the photograph. Ideally, a reveal that it was all some big prank and more likely a weird confession of love or a poem or something from Crispin. But no, just blank. And so I tore the photoshopped image into pieces, taking special care to decimate the micro-bikini lady and making sure my own head was definitively removed from the body and torn into a bazillion pieces. And once again, I know I'm an idiot for not photographing the evidence, or better yet, keeping it, but I was just so dumbfounded by it all that I wasn't thinking straight. So instead of doing any of the things I should have done, I shredded the photo, threw it in the trash, and then took the trash bag outside and put it in the outdoor garbage can. I figured the further away that I was from the cursed image, the less I'd have to think about it. And I didn't think about it again, not really, until that day at work a few days later. I was in the break room making myself a coffee when I heard the door open behind me. I greeted the newcomer with a "hey," knowing it'd be some member of our small department that I was friendly with. Now, I wasn't even concerned at the idea of it being Crispin. He'd behaved totally normally since the Secret Santa, and I was beginning to think that I maybe misunderstood a joke or overlooked a meme or something that I'd never seen before. And I felt his breath on my cheek before he even spoke. I had no idea how to react before he spun me around and stared me in the eyes, his face glowing and red with anger. "Why did you throw my gift in the trash?" he asked. And his fingers were squeezing tight against my arm, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely, terrifyingly threatened by a coworker. I kind of stammered out, not knowing what to say. How the hell could I explain it when it was so obvious why it was so gross, this inappropriate gift that I wouldn't want? He squeezed my arm tighter and then demanded again that I explain why I'd trashed the gift. And that's when I got mad. I shoved him away, back against the small table in the center of the room, and I let him have it with both barrels. I told him it was inappropriate, perverted, and completely unwanted. And then it hit me. How the hell did he know I'd thrown his gift in the trash? Could have been a lucky guess, but I wanted to know, so I asked. And the answer was very chilling and very simple. He told me matter-of-factly that he had a suspicion that I might do this, so he'd been checking my garbage. Like, holy crap, bro. I was taken aback and had no idea what to do or say other than ask why. Why the photo? Why this obsession? Did he have a thing for me? Was this some kind of attempt to win me over? Crispin acted insulted and almost disgusted, like the idea of being attracted to me was sickening to him. Now, I know he was trying to rile me up, but my dumb idiot self bit the bullet, demanding to know why that was so gross, and if so, why did he Photoshop such a weird, strange picture as my Secret Santa gift? And this a-hole had the temerity to claim that I was the one sexualizing it, and that it was simply a couple of people standing together and I chose to read that into it. My fake body had been basically naked, mind you, and you could see everything through that micro-bikini. That settled it. Crispin was a creepy nutjob, and I was the complete idiot not to keep the evidence proving it. Turns out that didn't matter though, because a minute later, Crispin had grabbed me completely out of the blue and was trying to force my face towards the stovetop, which I'd just used to boil some hot water for tea. Now he was yelling something about finding out how vain I'd be without my beauty or some crap. Just an utterly insane, delusional man. I tried screaming for help, knowing a couple of other coworkers had to be nearby. Thankfully, the first person to burst through the door was a guy named Greg, the department manager, and I didn't notice at the time, but he'd had to smash the door with a fire extinguisher. Crispin had locked us in from the inside. Now, it was only my terrified screams that caused Greg to know something serious was happening. He quickly tackled Crispin away from me, slamming him into a cupboard and punching him so hard in the side of the head that Crispin just collapsed like Santa's discarded sack. I was kind of taken aback that Greg had been so keen to defend me so violently, but he later explained that A, he'd heard enough through the door to know something bad was going to happen, and more disturbingly, B, Crispin had been bragging to some of the male coworkers that the Secret Santa gift that he was getting for his unnamed female colleague was going to make her dive straight into his bed. So, a creep all around then, I guess. Now naturally, Crispin got fired despite his apparent friendliness with the boss of the company, who mysteriously acted like he didn't even know the guy. I opted to press charges against Crispin for his attempt to burn my face, and thankfully the company had a secret security camera in the rec room/kitchen area that verified my story, albeit without sound. Crispin somehow managed to get a suspended sentence. I guess because his assault ultimately failed, but as far as I've heard on the grapevine, his lunatic behavior messed up his life for years to come, and I can't say that I have any sympathy for him. I still work at that company, promoted into Greg's position eventually, who himself has risen up the ranks. We still do Secret Santa even because we all decided that we weren't going to let one insane creep ruin the festive season for us. But we do tell new employees about the one guy who took it too far, without mentioning that I was the recipient, of course, just in case anyone else gets into their head that sending the most bizarre and unpleasant Secret Santa gift is the way to a fellow employee's heart. Spoiler, it isn't. So some years ago, my wife was caring for an elderly friend's mother during her final days. My wife has worked in care for many years, and as our friend's mother had advanced dementia, was entirely nonverbal and bedbound, the family needed some professional support to best help care for their mom. And as such, it was arranged that my wife would stay at their mom's house from Friday afternoon to the Sunday afternoon, as the family already took care of her around the clock during the week. And as the family has known me since childhood, they were more than happy for me to stay there over the weekend as well, and for our daughter, who had just turned 2 at the time, to be there as well with my wife, as my wife took care of their mom, who was bedbound in the lounge downstairs. And I knew the house well from my childhood, as it was right across the road from my friend's parents' house. As the family have known me since childhood, they were more than happy for me to stay there over the weekend as well, and for our daughter, who had just turned 2 at the time, to be there as well with my wife, as my wife took care of their mom, who was bedbound in the lounge downstairs. I knew the house well from my childhood, as it was right across the road from my friend's parents' house. And as a family, we had the second double room upstairs for my daughter and I, and my wife split the night between our upstairs room and a camp bed downstairs next to her patient for her hourly checks, as she had alarms set throughout the night. My daughter would toddle around the house and ask questions about the lady my wife cared for, who my daughter ended up referring to as Nana Flo. My daughter had explored the house thoroughly with my wife and I, but one day, we went upstairs to go to our room, and she wouldn't cross the landing. She outright refused and began to cry. I picked her up and asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she was very scared. And I asked her why, and she said that she felt frightened and sad upstairs, so we went back down and she seemed happier. At bedtime, I got her to sleep downstairs and carried her asleep up to bed. And the following day, we went upstairs after breakfast to get her dressed, and she again wouldn't cross the landing. I asked her what was scaring her, and she pointed to the box room door. And I asked her what she was pointing at, and she said, "The scary door." And the door was exactly the same as all the other doors on the landing. Dark brown, no detail other than the wood grain and a right-angled brass handle. I told her that there was nothing scary about the door and opened it to show her inside the room. It was a small room used for storing things Flo hadn't used in the years since she was bedbound. A chair, some board games, and a couple of piles of her clothes and a wooden rocking chair that used to be in the garden. I motioned for my daughter to join me in the room to show her that it wasn't scary, but she refused to enter and kept well back. Now, I was beginning to wonder at this point, as she was always very sunny, a very smiley little girl, so I asked her why she didn't like the door or the room, and she said one word: died. I left the room, shut the door, and got her dressed. 2 weeks go by and she still won't go near the door. But I either hurry her past whilst talking animatedly to her or carrying her. And just to clarify, I wasn't scared myself. Unnerved, definitely, but my daughter clearly was, and as I didn't want her to be, we just tried our best to deal with those moments quickly. Now, during one night, Flo slipped away in her sleep with my wife and daughter next to her holding her hand. We obviously didn't tell our daughter, as it would be a lot to process for a 2-year-old. I kept her upstairs, got her dressed, and packed our day bag as usual, and just got us ready to head downstairs and right out the front door so we didn't have to enter the lounge. As we got to the bottom of the stairs, Flo's adult daughter walked into the hall and saw us. Immediately seeing my daughter, she lit up and said hello to her in her cheeriest voice, considering the circumstances. My daughter suddenly took her hand and said, "Nana Flo's with the angels now." And her daughter just began crying and smiling quietly. We have no idea how she knew she'd passed. She'd passed maybe 3 hours previous, and my daughter and I had been maybe awake half an hour. And what's more, we're not a particularly religious family. My wife and I were both baptized, but we don't really attend church. And the first time my daughter attended church was 8 months later at a wedding, so we have no idea where she got the notion of angels from. And that will honestly stay with me forever. The craziest thing is that when my daughter was born, she didn't cry. She was so calm, and she also didn't cry on the way afterwards with my wife, even though all the other babies were. One older nurse commented to my wife, "She's been here before, that one." Maybe. I really can't get my head around why someone would actively want to hurt and scare children in the way that some people do. I guess some people just have something wired wrong in their brain, and maybe their own children were so terrible that they want to spread that pain to others. I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, although sometimes I wish I was. Now, I especially can't wrap my head around the kind of person who would try and ruin Christmas even further for kids who already have nothing. And this whole preamble is a setup for a story about an incident that occurred when I first started volunteering for Toys for Tots. You'd be surprised how many gifts that we'd received that were either damaged, non-functional, or otherwise simply not following the rules that allow us to pass the gifts on to needy children. Most of the time, it's just people trying to get rid of their unwanted junk, looking like a saint while doing so. That's why these initiatives usually don't allow open products or anything that could have been tampered with. I see people complaining online that we're ungrateful for not accepting anything but brand new sealed toys, but trust me, there are good reasons. And when I first started volunteering for the initiative, it wasn't a big official Toys for Tots group. It was a small, hastily cobbled together idea from the town officials, in particular the mayor, who was set up for re-election the next year. And as such, the whole thing wasn't very well organized at all, and not only did we allow unsealed secondhand donations, we also allowed people to bring in pre-wrapped gifts, ready for the kids to open, which looking back now is the stupidest oversight we could have made. Now, it happened about a week before Christmas. I was carting a pile of gifts to the storage room when I felt a sharp stab in the palm of my hand. It was immediately obvious that something in the gift itself had stabbed me. I placed the pile down on the table and inspected the offending item. A needle was sticking through the corner of the box and had jabbed me as I carried it. Now, my second thought was, holy crap, I've been stuck by a syringe and I need a blood test. But my first instinctual thought was, why is there a syringe in the children's gift? And so I opened the wrapped present carefully, and then the entire thing was a box of empty syringes. They looked like diabetic insulin needles with all the caps removed so that anyone who excitedly tore the package apart, a young child for example, would almost certainly end up stabbed by these needles. One of them had penetrated the corner of the box, which is what had stabbed me. I called my supervisors in, who immediately insisted that I go to the hospital to get checked out because who knows what those syringes were infected with. And I'm pretty sure that they were brand new needles for insulin designed to scare and hurt rather than infect anyone with anything. But I'd promised I'd go to the emergency room just as soon as we'd checked out the other gifts. Now, this part of the story isn't that exciting, so I'll just tell you now. I was fine, the syringes were clean, and my suspicion was correct. And we unwrapped every gift that had been donated pre-wrapped. 4 of the others used the same wrapping paper as the syringe box. Admittedly, it was a popular design, so we had to hope it was just a coincidence. Unfortunately, only one of the 4 was legitimate, a Bug's Life jigsaw puzzle. And here's the delightful list of things we discovered that some deranged soul had tried to pass on to children in need. At least, I hope and pray it was just one person. Firstly, we found a copy of Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree. The first few pages were normal, but then the darkness started. All the illustrations had been glued over with adult images, some of it being pretty graphic and hardcore. Now, give this book to a little kid and it either traumatized them or get them into some heavy, weird stuff at a very young age. And next was a doll that had been scrawled on and modified in a way that I'd rather not even get into explaining. It had been placed back into the box with a blanket wrapped around the toy so the modifications weren't immediately obvious either. And finally, and most disturbingly, there was a pretty expensive teddy bear. On the surface, this seemed fine, until one of my colleagues noticed some slightly incongruous stitching on its back. We didn't unpick it ourselves, but when we called the cops and handed the offending items over, we were later told that the teddy bear contained a medical blood bag filled with pig's blood. This happened in the 90s, and security cameras and due diligence were all a bit lax back where I worked then. And we were all devastated that our good deed, collecting gifts for the local orphanage, had been so corrupted by hopefully just one person looking to absolutely ruin Christmas for kids who already had a hard, grueling life. It just destroyed us all. We hadn't exactly received a lot of donations in the first place, so the meager offerings that we had for the children's home just felt extra pathetic now that this individual, who was never identified or caught, by the way, had absolutely destroyed something so wholesome. We proposed to the mayor and the township that next year we'd be far more vigilant with the gifts we accepted, refusing to allow pre-wrapped gifts and insisting that the toys for the kids had to be new and sealed. But ultimately they decided that no, this had put a strain on the whole thing and the initiative would be canceled going forwards. Thankfully, there are other towns, and these days there are much more official Toys for Tots initiatives that are well managed and carefully vetted. But if you're one of the many people who thinks we're too picky or demanding over what we'll accept, then please remember my story. There are some people out there who are just so sick and depraved that their idea of a good time is permanently ruining the festive season for little kids who already live difficult lives. I just hope that those people face judgment in the next life, or better yet, one day karma will bite them in the butt in this life. So just some background on my family's beliefs. I am spiritual, and my mother is Christian Orthodox, but a more spiritual denomination of it, and my father is absolutely atheist. The first encounter happened this time last year. I was home alone and sitting in my kitchen at the dining table, and from where I was sitting, I was able to see the front door into the living room and the back door into the living room leading into the garden, just to give some context to the layout. I was eating my food and looked up and saw a black, shadowy figure standing inside the house by the back door. I was instantly paralyzed with a sense of impending doom. Every time I looked away, it seemed to reach towards me, so I was unable to move and unable to look away. One thing to note is that after about 5 minutes of me looking at it, my cat started yowling at the front door to be let in. One thing about him is that he rarely meows, and on the rare occasion he does, it is extremely quiet, and this is the first time that I had heard him meow like that. After a few more minutes, I became hysterical and started screaming and crying. And the entire thing lasted about 40 minutes until my mom came home and got me out of my hysterical state. Now, another thing to note is that when the front door opened and my mom came in, and I did not recognize it as her, nor as a human, and I fell to the floor in fear. She immediately got me up and cleansed the entire house and all of the doorways. Now, I put this experience down to being a stress-induced hallucination, as I was going through a very stressful time then, or due to the new hormonal medication that I've been put on, hallucinations being a very rare side effect. Now, this was until the second encounter. I had been away from home the past 2 days, and when I got back today, my dad told me that he had seen a ghost, and when he took a picture of it, it disappeared next time he looked. Now, I was taken aback as he doesn't believe in the paranormal at all and does not joke about things like this. I asked to see the picture, and in the picture, I saw exactly what I had seen this time last year. I will attach the image that he took where you will see to the left of it the back door where the original instance occurred. I'm very worried, as my friend pointed out, that it has moved from the back door to the living room window, and due to the layout of my house, the entrance/viewpoint is my glass front door. And I suppose I'm looking for an explanation or any advice. I'm very frightened and I'm just not sure what to do. I never particularly enjoyed the company of my neighbor, Ronnie, back in the day. I can't say I disliked him or anything, but he was one of those cheerful, larger-than-life, middle-aged divorcees who always wanted to stop me and chat about sports that I didn't watch or weather I didn't care about. And he was the neighborhood gossip, too. And frankly, I didn't care that Mrs. Henderson was having an affair with a pool boy or that Lucy de la Roche was on antipsychotic medicine. The problem with Ronnie was that, being my direct next-door neighbor, he seemed to enjoy my company, and he also took it upon himself to be the life and soul of the neighborhood party, which meant that he hosted regular barbecues or arranged safari suppers, or invited us boys around for movie night at the home theater that he'd built in his basement. Now, okay, maybe that part was kind of cool and I don't mind those, but I often had to force myself to attend the cookouts and all of that. Now, living next door, new to the neighborhood and freshly divorced myself, it's not like I had a good reason to avoid Ronnie and his hospitality either. So I just kind of saw him as a necessary evil, an overly friendly and overwhelming cross that I had to bear in order to live in the otherwise fantastic, high-quality home in a lovely gated community that my parents had left to me when they retired to Arizona. And I still don't get why they retired there, of all places. Now, everything Ronnie did was just a little too loud and a little too obnoxious. He was always working on some DIY home improvement project, and he always had to start just a little too early and end a little too late, and make a little too much noise. And when he had family over for their get-togethers, his grandkids were just a little too loud and a little too obnoxious as well, and he had this shed where he did his projects. I would say that Ronnie's shed reminded me of that song, What's He Building in There? I don't know if you know it, but there was no secret about the crap Ronnie was making. He'd brag about it and show it off at any given opportunity. Picnic benches, refurbished recliner couches, reframed paintings that he'd found at the Goodwill. And then we, his lucky neighbors, would end up as the recipients of those half-finished, half-good refurbished projects that he managed to make a crazy amount of noise working on. Now, I feel bad talking crap on Ronnie like this, and I know that I seem like an a-hole, but would it help if I told you that Ronnie's here right now as I'm writing this and kind of goading me into making myself look like a jerk? You see, Ronnie and I are best friends now, ride or die, and I love him like a brother despite the 20-year age gap. And it's all because of one Christmas a few years ago where he drove me mad by playing that Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas Time by Paul McCartney on repeat. And like I said, Ronnie did everything just a bit bigger and just a bit louder, and this included Halloween and Christmas. As soon as October 1st rolled around, he'd go all out decorating the exterior of his house for the spooky season. December 1st, the same. Ronnie would be out there stringing up lights and setting Santa up on the roof, doing this whole grand display. And you gotta hand it to him, he did a great job. It was probably the highlight of the neighborhood each year, and if you want some context as to how much people liked Ronnie's Christmas decorations, consider this. They broke numerous HOA rules, and the HOA let them get away with it without a peep. And do you know how beloved in the community you have to be in order for the Homeowners Association to turn a blind eye to something? Yeah. And so, 'twas the night before Christmas, and all through the neighborhood, not a creature was stirring, except for the animatronics on Ronnie's lawn and the glowing flashing lights. I'd learned to just tolerate it by then, invested in a sleep mask instead of being the local neighborhood curmudgeon at 27. And what I couldn't stand, though, was the fact that he decided to play Christmas music at what felt like a pretty unreasonable volume at 11:18 p.m. Wonderful Christmas Time by Paul McCartney, and only that song too. And I heard it on repeat 4 times. There hadn't been music blaring from his house either. Was he having some kind of late-night family party? This just seemed weird even for loud, proud Ronnie. And then the song started for the 5th time, and this time it was louder. 6th, louder still. And eventually, when Paul freaking McCartney was on his 9th loop of singing "The Party's On" and "The Feeling's Here," my windows were rattling and I was just about ready to go over to Ronnie's and remind him about Mark David Chapman and the fate of another Beatle. Okay, maybe not quite that drastic, but I was gearing up to go over there and finally yell at the guy. Yes, even on Christmas Eve. And I could see the lights going on in other houses in our small gated community too. Silhouetted figures peering out at Ronnie's place. And as I was pulling on my coat and boots, the song looped again, even louder this time, and I knew that there was no going back. Time to pay my neighbor a visit and tell him and whatever guests he had that they needed to keep it the F down. Some of us had Christmas in the morning. From the way our houses are positioned, I can't see Ronnie's front porch from any of the windows I've been looking out of, so when I arrived on his lawn, I could immediately see something was off. For one thing, one of his beloved light-up Santas had been smashed. For another, his front door was wide open. Now, I thought about heading back to get my gun, but something told me that this was too urgent. Instead, I grabbed an axe resting against Ronnie's firewood pile and made my way into the house. The inside was a mess. The whole place had been trashed, like someone was looking for something. In particular, a lot of the pictures that he had on the walls had been pulled off and thrown to the ground. I followed that sound of wonderful Christmas time into the living room, and I'll never forget the sight that met my eyes. Ronnie was just lying there, in a pool of blood, somehow hooked up against the cabinet that held his old classic stack-based stereo system. His eyes were just sort of coming in and out of consciousness, and his hand rested on the volume knob. His fingers were slippery with blood, and he'd been trying to increase the volume to get someone's attention, he told me later. He managed to get the collar of his shirt hooked on the cabinet, so he was being held up, but I could immediately see why he wasn't able to move any more than he was. The man had been beaten within an inch of his life. Both of his legs were broken, one of them so badly that I could actually see the bone protruding from both ends of the break. One of his arms was broken too, and his good arm was just about capable of occasionally upping the volume on that player. Now, I could barely recognize the guy. His face was so swollen, caused by what I later discovered was an aluminum bat to the face over and over. And urgently I looked around for a phone, but Ronnie started convulsing and playing with the volume again. Now I shot them this look, and through the pain I could see that it was glancing upstairs. And just when he lowered the volume, I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Again, I tried to find Ronnie's landline, but he started acting frantic again. He wanted me to leave, but like hell was I leaving him to whatever fate the intruder had in store for him. Now, I was still holding that axe. I had no idea where Ronnie kept his guns, and to this day I have no idea why I behaved so recklessly and stupid, but it was Christmas Eve, so why not? I decided to rush upstairs and confront whoever had done this to Ronnie, armed with some rusty log-cutting axe. Now, immediately I saw the guy. He was short, and I had a good 80 pounds on him, and he was pulling pictures off the wall and opening cabinets, which I later found out was an attempt to find Ronnie's safe. I didn't even think. I didn't even feel like going down for murder by attacking a man from behind with an axe, so I flipped the weapon in my hand, and with all the force I could muster, I charged the intruder and cracked him in the side of the head with the handle of the axe. I expected him to fall immediately, but instead he turned to face me, fury in his eyes, as much as I could see through the ski mask anyway. I also saw that he was holding a pistol. Screw this, I thought, and swung the axe at him again, this time not caring about using the business end. Now, in my grand incompetence, I hit him with the butt of the metal axe, and this time he did fall. Now, the first thing I did was swipe up his gun. Next thing was realizing I was in Ronnie's office. I grabbed up as many USB and Ethernet cables as I could and put my Boy Scout training to use, tying the guy up as tightly and excessively as I could with goddamn computer cables. I didn't really know what to do next, so I kind of just sat on the couch in Ronnie's office with a gun trained on this intruder, and eventually realized that I was in shock when one of the other neighbors was standing in the doorway, shouting my name over and over to get my attention. Now, the story's getting hella long now, so I'll just summarize the rest. The intruder was Ronnie's estranged son, who decided that Christmas Eve was the perfect time to rob his dad of the valuables that he kept in his safe. It turned out that Ronnie was a pretty rich man and kept a lot of valuables on hand for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, his son, who has become estranged through the whole series of events that isn't really another man's business to share here, decided to finally cause his old man to croak and take everything. Ronnie decided that he owed me a life debt for saving him, and after that I couldn't get rid of him even if I wanted to. And it surprised me to realize that I didn't want to. I liked Ronnie quite a lot, in fact, and eventually we became best buds. Like I said, he's here while I write this, encouraging me to do it, in fact. And now he's wheelchair-bound, sadly, but his injuries really took a lot out of him, and his son won't be getting out of prison anytime soon. Ronnie struggles to be the master of ceremonies for cookouts and Halloween and Christmas now, so I help him, almost like a Robin to his Batman. And he refused to move out despite all the bad events and memories, and honestly, I'm just so glad that he stuck around. He's one of the best people I've ever known, and I still feel like a jerk having such a negative opinion on him early on, just for being larger-than-life friendly. But he says it's my penance that I have to share this part of the story, and Ronnie loves nothing more than giving me a hard time. So every Christmas now, since the events of 10 years ago, I help Ronnie decorate for Christmas. And my now wife joins in too, and my 2-year-old daughter already calls him Uncle Ron Ron. Life's very different now for both of us, and it was a terrible, harrowing experience, but we came out of it with a kind of lifelong friendship you'd be extremely lucky to find. And there's only one rule that we have between us though. Never, ever again are we going to listen to A Wonderful Christmas Time. Screw that song. But Merry Christmas. I never thought to Google what this is until discussing it with my wife today, and strongly believe that we had a mimic growing up. Reading some of your accounts of very similar events brought me to actual tears, and I've told these stories to people throughout my life and have never forgotten it. It presented itself several times in the house over the course of many years, twice in very similar ways, and stopped after the final one. And when I was very young, probably 6 or so, I woke up late at night to see my mom cross by my door. My parents' bedroom and mine were next to one another at the time, with a bathroom across the hall. It was very specifically my mom, and she had a specific nightgown on. I called out to her, and it arched its back and contorted itself in a way that I can only describe as like when a cat does it. I put my head back down and covered my head, and when I looked again, she was gone. Now fast forward a few years to maybe middle school. I'm downstairs alone and the power goes out in the middle of the day. The house was a bit older and had ratty drop ceilings in the basement, so whenever I was down there, I could usually tell where everyone in my family was. A second after, the power goes out, and I hear a solid minute of what sounded like very heavy boots stomping around upstairs, and thuds and rattling as if things in the house were being dragged and thrown around. After it stopped and I eventually went upstairs, there wasn't a thing out of place. Now the third physical event was another few years later, near the end of high school. I sometimes would doze off on the couch in the basement on the weekends, staying up too late. I woke up, looked over the back of the couch, and what looked like my dad was sitting at my family computer. The lights were off downstairs, but I could see him in the glow of the monitor. This was pretty unusual, as my dad was not really a night owl, and I called out to him, and the same thing as the first time happened, as I can only describe it as bristling and changing its posture to be deeply hostile, looking without turning to look at me. I put my head back down for a second to compose myself and try to get a grip and make sure that I wasn't just freaking myself out or making absolutely sure that I was awake. And I got back up and was gone. Now, I was not sleeping. I stood up and went upstairs after that and was up for a while. And the last thing, after a few years ahead when I was a part way through college, I got home pretty late and the hallway near my bedroom was unnaturally, weirdly cold in one area, much more so than the rest of the house. Now, I knew full on something was strange, but tried to put it out of my mind and force myself to be rational. I got in bed and felt someone sit on the edge of the bed on the side away from where I was facing. Totally frozen in shock at this point, it put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Hey, wake up." In what sounded like my dad's voice, who was pretty soft-spoken and not threatening sounding at all. Mind you, I was not asleep at all, and I shot up at this point and nobody was there. The last occurrence felt sort of final in a weird way that I can't exactly explain. And I lived there full-time for another couple of years until I finished college, visited for days at a time often, and then full-time another 6 months a few years later when changing careers and moving back home from an out-of-state job. Not a hair out of place in the house ever again, and I never told my parents about it, but I just wanted to share with you guys, having spent some time tonight reading other people's stories and realizing that I wasn't alone in this kind of specific phenomenon. Why it presented itself in such a frightening way but spoke so gently, I have no idea. It freaks me out talking about it to this day. So we moved to this house 2 years ago. Previous owners were here for 2 years. The ones before were here for a year, and the ones before that were here for a decade. They were the original owners. I'm not a witchy person, but I know that there's stuff out there that I can't explain. I know salt, ash, and blood are powerful tools, and 3 a.m. scares me. Now, I have a preschool-aged girl. My mother watches her while I work, and my mom sent me this text yesterday saying, "Creepy story. I forgot to plug in the kid's tablet and it died, and while it was charging, she was on the floor playing with her dinosaurs. She got up, came over, and asked me, 'Why did you open my door?' And her door is closed. I told her that no one opened her door and that it is closed, and she said that a person opened her door and stomped into her room and that they were wearing stripes all over. And I asked her when this happened, and she just kept repeating the story. I stopped myself from asking if it scared her and didn't want to put that idea into her head. I wasn't sure how to ask her how it made her feel, and she seemed to be more curious than scared. Now, around this time last year, my kid kept walking up crying about angry eyebrows in her walls, and I had her help me rub her walls with salt and burned a candle. Apparently it helped a lot, and she hadn't been scared or said anything creepy since until yesterday. And then last night, while I was putting her to bed, she kept looking at her door and quietly sobbing, saying, oh no, and hiding her face. I couldn't get any info out of her, but I had a very icky, off feeling. Middle of the night, at 3:48, there was a loud thud picked up by our baby monitor, but nothing to cause it, and she didn't wake up. I'm trying to convince myself that this was just the cat being a cat, though nothing in the hallway was disturbed. The monitor doesn't record, and it's just a cheap one, basically almost like a walkie-talkie. But what do? What can I do? Should I get my kid into therapy? Should I burn some sage that I grew myself? Not smudging, as that's a closed practice, I just know that it's a cleansing plant. Should I salt her room again? Add ash? I tried asking in the witch subreddit and then the spells subreddit, and they both said that this belonged here in r/paranormal, instead then deleted my posts. Just help me out because I'm scared. So last October, I moved to Hawaii completely alone. I was unhappy with my life back home and needed a change. I left behind a decently well-paying job that I hated and took a leap of faith, even though I only knew one person on the island. The transition was hard. There were days that I questioned why I had come and what I was looking for. And one afternoon, while playing pickleball, a man approached me. And it was a black man with the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. And we started chatting casually, and then, out of nowhere, he began telling me things about my life that no stranger could possibly know. He said I was from Chicago. He named the exact 2 streets my old apartment in Chicago was located, and he said that I had 3 brothers, which I told him no. And after a minute, I realized that he was talking about my blood brother and my 2 stepbrothers. I don't see my stepbrothers, so I don't even think about that right away. And he told me that I was Polish and spoke about the close bond that I have with my mother. And every detail was true. I was completely stunned. My first thought was that he might be a stalker, but the conversation continued. He told me he had this sense, and that I was meant to speak with him. And without me mentioning my career, he said that I would soon find a job that I truly love. And then he told me that I'd meet my person and be married at 27, and that I'd have 3 children. I am a 24-year-old female, and those were all things that I've been quietly worrying about. And as strange as it all was, I didn't feel afraid. I felt this very deep sense of peace, like I was exactly where I needed to be. And when it was my turn to play, we wrapped up our conversation and he said something like, "I'm always here. You'll find me around." And I walked toward the court, but after only a few seconds, I turned back to look for him, and he was gone. Completely vanished. The courts were fenced in, so there was no way that he could have just walked off unnoticed in that short amount of time, and also wired so I wouldn't be able to see him even if he did. I played there often and have never seen him again, and it was one of the most surreal and unexplainable moments of my life, and I still think about it all the time. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured in the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Check it out, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends.